income. That all happens tonight on C-SPAN 2's Book TV. And now Book TV is live with author and historian Gerald Horne. He's the author of several books on race and history, including his most recent, Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary. For the next 3 hours, Gerald Horne will be answering your questions.
Professor Gerald Horne, in your book, The Counterrevolution of 1776, you write, as the 21st century proceeds, one point is evident. The heroic creation myth of the founding of the U.S. is desperately in need of revisiting. What does that mean?
What it means is that I think the historians, by and large, have not done a very good job of talking about the founding of the United States of America. What's striking is that in history departments from the Atlantic to the Pacific, you have specialists who critique the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Cuban Revolution. But those who critique 1776 are few and far between, despite the fact that after the founding of the United States of America, you had more land expropriated from the Native Americans, clearly, which meant that 1776 was not necessarily a step forward for the indigenous population. And then by the 1790s, you had the United States, as I note in that book, had taken over the control of the slave trade in Africans to Cuba. By the 1840s, as I said in my book, The Deepest South, the U.S., Brazil, and the African slave trade, the United States had taken control, the U.S. nationals had taken control of the slave trade to Brazil. So it seems to me that minimally one can say that 1776 was not a great leap forward for Africans, nor was it a great leap forward for the indigenous population. It was a great leap forward for many Europeans, that is to be sure. But Europeans, as we well know, do not comprise the entirety of humanity. And I think what it set in motion is what actually we're seeing in 2016. That is to say, with 1776, you had the progressive expropriation of land from the indigenous population. And then that land was parceled out, oftentimes to Europeans fresh off the boat, which helps to solidify a cross-class coalition between poor Europeans and more affluent Europeans at the expense of the indigenous population and, of course, the Africans who then stocked that land as enslaved, bonded laborers. And in 2016, once again, you see a kind of cross-class coalition on the Republican side between and amongst Europeans of various class backgrounds. And for those who say or who think that Make America Great Again fundamentally means Make America White Again, well, they have a point to be made. I think part of the problem is that since we haven't had a critique of 1776 to the extent that it deserves one, it becomes very difficult to understand the present. I mean, if you go to a doctor and you have an illness, one of the first things the doctor will do is take a medical history. Hopefully you will provide an adequate and accurate medical history that will allow the doctor to make a diagnosis and a prognostication with regard to your future well-being. Well, we haven't had an adequate history, it seems to me, of the founding, which makes it very difficult to understand the present.
And in your book, Powell v. Alabama, you write, the U.S. had been founded in the 18th century on the principle of white supremacy.
Well, it goes back to what I said a moment or two ago. That is to say that in some ways, if you look at 1776, and this is what I tell my students when I teach these undergraduates an Introduction to African American Studies, that it's fair to say that 1776 and the U.S. Constitution did represent a step forward in terms of religious liberty. To that point, of course, religious wars had been racking Europe in particular. Protestant London versus the so-called Catholic powers, France and Spain, particularly for contestation over the Americas. Portuguese, of course, also being predominantly Catholic. But what happens with 1776, and I argue that in order to widen the base of support for the Republican project in North America, the so-called Democratic project in North America, there was a step forward in terms of religious liberty, because this allowed the settlers here to widen their base of support against the crown in London. And so, therefore, it's fair to say that the settlers in North America, led by George Washington, would not have prevailed but for assistance from Catholic France. This leads inevitably and inexorably to the First Amendment guaranteeing religious liberty. Now, even with that, of course, we all know that anti-Catholicism prevailed in the 19th century, the burning of convents. We know that anti-Catholicism prevailed a century ago with the rise of the second iteration of the Ku Klux Klan. We also know that despite steps forward in terms of the fight against anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish fervor, even in 2016, that particular beast continues to raise its ugly head. But generally speaking, 1776 was a step forward for religious liberty. What the historians have missed is the flip side of that coin, that the so-called Republican project did mean that religion took a step backwards. It also meant that monarchy took a step backwards, but substituted for the aristocracy of ancestry and heritage and lineage, as was prevalent in London, you had the aristocracy of race, quite frankly, which the country is still wrestling with. And in fact, you can make the argument, and I have made the argument, that that project of the aristocracy of race didn't begin to retreat until the 20th century with the rise of the class project, the rise of thriving trade unions, the rise of socialist countries, national liberation movements, etc., which then began to give assistance to those who were suffering under the lash of racism and white supremacy, which forced an agonized retreat from the most egregious aspects of white supremacy in 1954, May 17, with the Brown versus Board of Education decision, and then 1964 with the Civil Rights Act, 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. But as that international assistance and pressure began to wither in the latter part of the 20th century and the first decade or so of the 21st century, you began to see a reassertion of some of these uglier aspects of white supremacy, as represented, for example, with this incredible spate of police shootings in San Diego and Tulsa, Charlotte, Chicago, Milwaukee. The list of tortured sites is too numerous to mention. And part of the dilemma for the black community in particular is that as a result of Brown versus Board of Education and that retreat from the more egregious aspects of white supremacy, a trade-off was made. That is to say, the more internationalist leaders of the black community who were willing to make these sorts of global alliances, I'm thinking of Paul Robeson in the first place, were marginalized, isolated, demonized, etc. And so now, as I've said repeatedly, and whenever there's a microphone in my face, in 2016, despite the fact that you have these major crises in Ukraine, North Korea, Syria, to mention a few, there are few black intellectuals and leaders that have anything credible or meaningful to say, despite the fact that any of those crises inevitably, or perhaps inevitably, could lead to something worse, up to and including planetary extinction, perhaps. So this is where we stand in 2016.
Dr. Horne, 2.5 million people resided in the U.S. in 1776. What was the role of African Americans, of slaves, during the Revolution, if any?
Well, we were told in our classrooms by Crispus Attucks, who some would have it that he was the first person to lay down his life for liberty, quote unquote. Although, of course, Crispus Attucks is defined as black. In another country, he might have been defined as Native American, given his ancestry. But what we're not told, of course, generally speaking, is about the Africans who fought against the founding of the United States. Interestingly enough, I was just watching the second version of Roots. You recall the first version came out based on the Alex Haley book in the 1970s. It took the nation by storm. I was watching the second version, which just came out this year, I believe. And they do a credible effort in terms of trying to illustrate that last point that I just made. That is to say that since Britain was on a faster track to abolition of slavery, as represented by Somerset's case in June 1772, the black population had reason to believe that their interests would be better served if the settlers were defeated. That's a very difficult point for people in the United States to grapple with. I might also say that there is another TV miniseries that you can find easily. I won't mention the sources. The Book of Negroes. It's a BET, Black Entertainment Television, which I believe is headquartered in Washington, a BET Canadian and South African production, which I think does the best job yet in terms of film and cinema, in terms of presenting an accurate portrayal of the black role during the 1776 war. In any case, enslaved Africans, of course, were bonded laborers. As I tell the story, if you're trying to understand 1776, you should try to understand 1688. That's the so-called Glorious Revolution in England, where the wings of the monarch are clipped by the rising merchant class. To that point, the Royal African Company, which had been under the thumb of the monarch, was the major force in terms of the African slave trade. But with the clipping of the wings of the monarch, there was a deregulation, if you like, of the African slave trade, and merchants, too numerous to mention, were able to enter this odious commerce, sailing to Africa, manacling and handcuffing every African in sight with the maniacal energy of crazed bees, dragging them across the Atlantic to work in the tobacco fields of the Chesapeake in particular. And of course, in the Caribbean, which up to the middle of the 18th century, London thought was more valuable than the North American mainland. Of course, the story should be told in terms of 1776 in conjunction with the Caribbean, because the Africans outnumbered the Europeans, sometimes at a rate of 10 to 1 or 20 to 1 in the Caribbean, Jamaica, Antigua, Barbados, creating fertile ground for the rise of slave revolts, which is not only jeopardizing the investments, but jeopardizing the lives of the slave owners and their families. And this, of course, leads to a certain kind of retrenchment on the mainland, where the ratios are much more favorable to slavery, but that does not necessarily save the settlers, because in 1739 you have Stono's revolt. Actually, before that, in 1712, you have the revolt of the enslaved in Manhattan, 1739 in South Carolina, basically spearheaded by Angolans, who not only many of them could speak Portuguese, but many of them were actually Roman Catholic. Purportedly, they were trying to get to Spanish Florida. Florida at that time was controlled by Spain, and there was a direct collaboration between Spain and the enslaved Africans in South Carolina to overthrow the settler class in South Carolina. And so what happens finally in 1756 to 1763 is the so-called 7 Years' War, where London seeks to eliminate the Spanish threat to their settlements in Florida and the French threat in Quebec, because there's evidence to suggest that the French were assisting the Africans in Manhattan in 1712. That is a very successful effort, the 7 Years' War. Of course, we all know that even today as we speak, Canada, Quebec in particular, has a predominantly French-speaking population. But in any event, London prevails. They want to tax the settlers because the wars were to their benefit. And this is where the traditional narrative kicks in, because I think there's accuracy there. The settlers did not want to pay these taxes, which is a very familiar theme in Washington, D.C. to this very day. And that leads to the revolt against British rule in collaboration with the French in particular against London, which then brings us back to the Constitution and the religious liberty, the First Amendment, etc.
What was the role of, who was Lord Dunmore, and what was his role in the Revolution?
Lord Dunmore, I was at a conference at the CUNY Graduate Center in New York about a year ago, and a leading historian, he started off making what he thought was a cynical comment about the parallels between Lord Dunmore, the last British colonial governor in Virginia in 1775, and Abraham Lincoln. He thought it was a cynical comment. I thought he was about to say something that I agreed with. That is to say, Lord Dunmore was very upset, shall we say, with the fact that settlers led by George Washington and Thomas Jefferson wanted to overthrow British rule. in Virginia and in North America generally. So he tried to cut a deal with the Africans. As a matter of fact, this is represented in the second version of Roots that I was just making reference to the filmmaker's credit. And in return for liberty for the enslaved, they would fight with the Redcoats, with London's forces. Of course, this did not win Lord Dunmore many plaudits amongst the settlers, to put it mildly. He became notoriously unpopular. But this leading historian, when he was drawing what he thought was a parallel between Lord Dunmore and Abraham Lincoln, I think he was making a point unintentionally, which is, of course, that the Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863, in some measure, as I say in my book, Negro Comrades of the Crown, was a military measure, because in terms of trying to free the enslaved population that the United States did not have jurisdiction over, that is to say in the so-called Confederate States of America, that was a turning point in terms of the war, because it allowed for the enlistment of more black soldiers, as represented in the film Glory, starring Denzel Washington. And this then allows the U.S., or the Union forces, the blue, to prevail over the gray, the so-called Confederate States of America. It didn't work in 1775 with Lord Dunmore for various reasons, including the fact that there has been criticism of Lord Dunmore that he didn't go far enough, that he should have been trying to offer freedom to the enslaved or the loyalists, that is to say, those who did not defect from the Union Jack, from London. But in any case, Lord Dunmore is a very important figure in the foundation of the United States of America.
Gerald Horne, if you were to write a general history book for school kids today, what would be the first line in that book?
I'm not sure what the first line would be, but I'm giving a talk in a few days at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, founded by Carter G. Woodson, the leading black historian over a century ago. And in that talk, I'm taking off from an important seminar that was held in Washington, D.C. in May 2016, in the run-up, when it was first initiated, to the opening of the National African American Museum here in Washington, which has received reams of publicity for understandable reasons. And at that seminar in Washington in May, one leading historian asked, a number of historians asked, do we need a new interpretive framework for the United States of America? One historian said, is From Slavery to Freedom, popularized by John Hope Franklin, is that still a valid interpretive framework for Black American history? Or August Meyer and Elliot Rutwick, From Plantation to Ghetto. Another historian said, well, actually what we need is a new interpretive framework for U.S. history. And what I'm going to say in Richmond in a few days is the answer to that latter question is yes. And it should be from settler colonialism to U.S. imperialism. And as I tell this audience in Richmond, that will allow us to incorporate more effectively the present-day diversity of the Black American population. In Houston, for example, where I teach, the Black American population has been enriched tremendously by waves of migrants and immigrants from Nigeria in particular. I mean, people think of Hakeem Olajuwon, for example. The University of Houston basketball star goes on to perform for the Houston Rockets and the Toronto Raptors. In New York City, for example, for at least a century, if not longer, there has been a tidal wave of migrants from Jamaica and Antigua, Barbados. In Miami, a significant percentage of the Black population has roots in Haiti in particular. And for various reasons, the traditional narratives are not able to account for that kind of diversity. And that's why I think we need this new interpretive framework so that we can account for the actual reality on the ground.
You mentioned earlier Paul Robeson. From your new book, Paul Robeson, The Artist is Revolutionary, you write, you cannot fully appreciate how the Jim Crow system came to an end without an understanding of the life of Paul Robeson. Robeson pioneered the struggle against Jim Crow throughout the 30s and 40s.
That is true, despite the fact that I wrote it. That is to say that Paul Robeson, a Black American born in New Jersey in 1898, passing away in Philadelphia in 1976, leading scholar as an undergraduate at Rutgers University in New Brunswick, New Jersey, where he stars on the gridiron, stars as a baseball catcher, stars in athletics generally. Leaves there and goes to Columbia University and graduates and was on the fast track to becoming a lawyer, but is diverted, although I should say that he also is an early performer in professional football. But his career as a lawyer is diverted, and he stumbles into performing and becomes a leading actor, a kind of precursor of Denzel Washington or Will Smith, if you like, not only on the screen, silver screen, but also on stage. Othello is his signature role. A good deal of his stardom is created in London, where he lives from the early 1920s until the late 1930s, with intermittent trips to the United States of America. There's a whole digression we could engage in now with regard to black expatriates and how so many black Americans over the decades and centuries have been treated much better abroad than in the place of their birth, which leads to this expatriating themselves to live overseas. But a turning point for Paul Robeson comes when he visits newly fascist Germany in the early 1930s and comes face to face with the rising tide of fascism. He also goes on to Moscow, where he encounters another black lawyer, William Patterson, who I wrote a biography about that came out a few years ago, who graduated from law school at the University of California, now the Hastings School of Law in San Francisco, and of course attended undergraduate school at the University of California at Berkeley, where I attended law school. And William Patterson had become an early member of the U.S. Communist Party, had gone to Moscow to be trained as a professional revolutionary, actually spoke some Russian. He convinces Robeson that he should devote more of his time and energy to the cause of his people. This is during the context of the Scottsboro Case, the subject of the book I wrote, Powell versus Alabama. And I'll mention that, of course, shortly, the details of that case. But in any case, Paul Robeson is convinced that he should spend more time in the United States of America. Facilitating that is the onset of World War II in Europe in 1939. He has reason to believe that he and his family might be trapped in London. You know that London was bombed repeatedly by the German fascists during World War II, and people were sleeping in subways, etc. So he returns to the United States, helps to convince black Americans that they should throw in their lot with the United States in the anti-fascist cause. And that's not necessarily a slam dunk proposition, because I'm writing a book that'll be published next year by NYU Press called Facing the Rising Sun, African Americans, Japan, and the Rise of Afro-Asian Solidarity, which talks about the pro-Tokyo sentiment in black America. In fact, in this book, I talk about how in November 1942 in East St. Louis, Illinois, right across the Mississippi River from my hometown of St. Louis, you have black Americans in military uniform drilling in anticipation of a Japanese invasion of North America. That's the kind of sentiment that Paul Robeson had to overcome, which he successfully does, convincing black Americans once again that they should make the ultimate sacrifice, a blood sacrifice, to help to rescue the United States. But no good deed goes unpunished. And so after World War II, with Japan defeated as the result of the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 1945, the Red Scare starts, and Paul Robeson, who was a socialist, thought to be a communist, is persecuted and demonized. His income falls from the 6 figures to the 4 figures. His passport is taken, so he cannot travel abroad to make a living. But he's still dishing out blows, despite the blows that he's absorbing. 1950, 1951, Robeson and Patterson file a petition with the United Nations charging the United States with genocide against black people. Reference here, an article in the Washington Post just a few days ago, where a United Nations body said that because of the racial terrorism inflicted on black Americans, the black Americans deserve reparations for the maltreatment and mistreatment they've absorbed over the years. This genocide petition, We Charge Genocide, it's translated into numerous languages. It's sold all over the world, but this does not necessarily win plaudits in Washington. Paul Robeson has hauled repeatedly before congressional committees. Patterson, in fact, is jailed. Paul Robeson is not jailed, but his income does plummet. Finally, an international movement leads to the return of Paul Robeson's passport. He immediately decamps to London and stars once again in Othello. But by 1965, not only is his health deteriorating, but his wife had passed away, so he returns to the United States and becomes a virtual recluse in a working class community in Philadelphia until he passes away in January 1976. Although, as I mentioned in the book, he is saluted by the rising civil rights movement, the Coretta Scott King, Martin Luther King, even Andrew Young, the forces in SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the shock troops of the movement in the Deep South. They're all very praiseworthy, if you like, of Paul Robeson, although he's more controversial, shall we say, in other circles. But as I say in the last paragraph of that book, there are those who would suggest that the figure of Stalin, the former leader in Moscow for 30 years, discredits the idea of socialism for all time, and in fact, the Robeson Project. If that's the case, why isn't the African slave trade discredited the United States for all time, discredited to capitalism for all time? Why the double standard? Until we unravel these knots, I think we'll be wandering in the wilderness.
You said thought to be a communist. Was it illegal to be a communist in the U.S.?
Effectively, after 1949, when another comrade of Patterson and Robeson, Ben Davis Jr., a black man born in Atlanta, his father was a leading member of the Republican Party and one of the most affluent black Americans in the United States. And Ben Davis Jr. went on to Amherst College and Harvard Law School, but joined the Communist Party in the early 1930s, and it was elected to New York City Council in 1941, I believe, 1943, and then reelected in 1945 before ousted unceremoniously, perhaps illegally, in 1949, and then put on trial, and then was jailed in federal prison in Terre Haute, Indiana. In some ways, that effectively illegalized the Communist Party. And even if that's not a technically accurate assertion, certainly I think it's fair to say that the persecution and demonizing of those who have advocated for socialism in the United States has left a continuing shadow over this country. And that's why I'm very appreciative of the campaign of Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont, who went a long way towards helping to detoxify the concept of socialism and clarifying the concept of socialism, and in the process attracting many millennials, that is to say, U.S. folk under the age of 35, to his banner. But in any case, there's still an uphill climb, it seems to me, with regard to that process that Bernie Sanders did so much to assist.
Gerald Horne, how do you identify yourself politically?
I identify myself, my late friend Manning Marable called himself, he was the biographer of Malcolm X, you might recall, winning a Pulitzer Prize. He called himself, and I was part of his cohort, radical Democrats, and I accept that term. I accept the term socialist as well. I accept the term anti-fascist. I accept the term black liberation militant. I accept the term peace activist. I accept the term feminist. I accept the term humanitarian. I think I have multiple identities that I embrace.
What about communist?
Some of my best friends are communists. But as I said in my book on John Howard Lawson, the Jewish American communist and founder of the Screenwriters Guild, when they would ask him if he were a communist, he would say, "We're not allowed to say." That's a joke. But some of my best friends are communists. Jarvis Tyner in New York City, who served a long time as a leader of the U.S. Communist Party, the brother of McCoy Tyner, the great pianist. So I identify with that movement. Certainly, your producers asked me before this program people I found inspiring. And one of the people I listed was Govan Mbeki. Govan Mbeki was a leader of the South African Communist Party, a party that works hand in glove with the African National Congress of South Africa, of Nelson Mandela. And if you accept what the late Anglo-Dutch historian Stephen Ellis says in one of his books, Nelson Mandela himself had been co-opted to the Central Committee of the South African Communist Party. And there's an oral history interview at the University of Connecticut in Storrs that I just read a few days ago by Andrew Mlagany, who was in cell block 7, when Mandela in cell block 5 at Robben Island with him serving, or it might have been the reverse, who confirms what Stephen Ellis has written. I mean, Pablo Picasso, Sean O'Casey, the great Irish writer. So I don't run in horror from the idea of even being called a communist.
Throughout your 31 books, there seems to be this confluence of communists and African Americans and their causes.
That's true, although of late you might have noticed I've been writing more about slavery. And what's striking about that is that in some ways it's more difficult to write about slavery and publish about slavery in the United States than to write about communists, as I do, which is very interesting. I think it's because slavery happened here, and it's a very difficult question still for people to grapple with and to reconcile the soaring narrative, uplifting narrative in the United States with this gruesome, dirty story of what happened to Africans. So it's easier to try to glide past it. But certainly I've written a number of books about communists, including, in fact, my book about Hawaii, Fighting in Paradise, labor unions. I can't remember the subtitle, Labor Unions and Communism, Making a Modern Hawaii, something like that, where I talk about Frank Marshall Davis. And my writing about Frank Marshall Davis has launched right-wing blogs too numerous to mention because Frank Marshall Davis, who was very closely associated, shall we say, with the Communist Party of Hawaii, which was probably the most successful Communist Party under the U.S. flag. He was a black American, born in Kansas, came to prominence in Chicago before moving to Honolulu on December 7th, 1948, a day he said that would forever live in infamy. And there he comes to mentor a young man who grows up to be president of the United States. And of course, that's where the right-wing blogs enter, because, of course, that simple fact has led some to suggest that the President of the United States is, a Manchurian candidate, so to speak, tutored by this communist to move into the White House, to wreak havoc on the United States of America. But as I say in the book, if you look at Honolulu, if you look at Hawaii, where left influence was the strongest under the U.S. flag, you'll find a state that was in the vanguard in terms of women's right to choose under the U.S. flag, in terms of labor union protections, for example. This was due in no small measure to the efforts of the International Longshore and Warehousemen's Union, headquartered in San Francisco under the leadership of Harry Bridges, who you may recall was accused of being a communist. The United States tried to deport him numerous times. Well-born in Melbourne, Australia, he of course, migrates to San Francisco in the 1930s, where he leads the San Francisco General Strike of 1934, and then begins to unionize the islands, the archipelago of Honolulu, and helps to convert what was really a white supremacist redoubt into what has become the most progressive force under the U.S. flag. I mean, that's the kind of story that I try to write about and talk about when I write about communists. And let me crowdsource at this point. I would really like to write some more about Hawaii, because it's a very pleasant place to visit and do research. So any callers, listeners, people, tweet, Facebook, email, if you got a project that'll bring me back to Hawaii, please communicate it to me sooner rather than later.
And good afternoon and welcome to Book TV on C-SPAN 2. This is our monthly in-depth program where we invite one author on to talk about his or her body of work. And this month, it's Professor Gerald Horne. He teaches at the University of Houston. And here's a partial list of his currently 31 books. Fire This Time, The Watts Uprising and the 1960s came out in 1997. Powell v. Alabama, The Scottsboro Boys and American Justice also came out in 1997. Race Woman, The Lives of Shirley Graham Du Bois came out in 2000. Class Struggle in Hollywood came out in 2001. Race War, White Supremacy, and the Japanese Attack on the British Empire came out in 2003. Black and Brown, African Americans and the Mexican Revolution, 2005. W.E.B. Du Bois, a biography, came out 6 years ago. The Counterrevolution of 1776, which we've discussed briefly, came out in 2014. Race to Revolution, the U.S. and Cuba during slavery and Jim Crow also came out that year. And last year, Confronting Black Jacobins, the U.S., the Haitian Revolution, and the Origins of the Dominican Republic. And finally, his most recent book is on Paul Robeson, The Artist as Revolutionary. This is your chance to talk with Professor Horne. We're going to put the phone numbers up here in a second. We're also going to show you ways that you can contact us via social media. 202 is the area code, 748-8200 if you live in the East and Central time zones, 748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. Now you can also email Professor Horne at booktv@cspan.org, or you can send a tweet at booktv is our Twitter handle. And finally, facebook.com/booktv is our Facebook page. You'll see it right there at the top of the page. You can make a comment under his picture there. Professor Horne, March 1931. Mm-hmm. What happened?
This is the Scottsboro case, a case that I write about in the Paul versus Alabama book, and a case that I also talk about in my biography of William Patterson at University of Illinois Press, Black Revolutionary. As I tell the story, it's a turning point in the history of the struggle against Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid. These were 9 black youth arrested for allegedly sexually molesting 2 Euro-American women on the fast track in Alabama to being executed, the fate and destiny of so many black Americans before and since accused falsely of crimes. But what happens is that William Patterson intervenes in the form of assistance from the International Labor Defense, a so-called Communist Front. Certainly it had been initiated and energized by the U.S. Communist Party, assisted by Moscow, and it helps to organize an international campaign around the case of the Scottsboro 9, as they were called. But it's also marks a turning point, because what happens is that international pressure is placed on the United States to retreat from the more egregious and horrible aspects of Jim Crow. There are demonstrations at U.S. embassies and consulates all over the world. In my book on Cuba, I talk about the demonstrations that take place in Havana, where actually Cubans are killed protesting in favor of the Scottsboro 9. This case leads to important Supreme Court precedents with regard to the right to trial by jury, having black Americans, in fact, serve on juries. These U.S. Supreme Court precedents are still being utilized to this very day. So the Scottsboro case is a necessary prelude to talking about Brown versus Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycott, etc. Although I think that the difference between these two historical epochs, the 1930s and the 1950s, is that by the 1950s, people like Paul Robeson and William Patterson were on the defensive, and the movement, which was then benefiting from the fact the United States was seeking to accuse Moscow of human rights violations, but found it difficult to do so as long as the stain of Jim Crow was permanently cited on the escutcheon of the United States of America. This creates a dynamic whereby Jim Crow retreats in the 1950s, but the problem being that the leadership at that time was not as internationally connected or as sophisticated as the Robesons and Pattersons, and therefore were not able to take advantage of the favorable objective conditions that then obtained. But in any case, the Scottsboro case is a highly important case. It's been written about numerous times by a number of historians. It's been the subject of cinema, at least TV movies, as I recall, and certainly deserves all of the attention that it has received.
Was it widely publicized outside of northern Alabama at the time?
Oh, absolutely. It was a national case. And in fact, it was a global case. There is a book Princeton University Press published a few years ago about some of the international aspects of the Scottsboro case. It was very embarrassing to the United States of America because, of course, when you talk about the Scottsboro case, you open the door to a larger discussion of so-called separate but equal, of so-called Jim Crow, U.S. apartheid, not only separate schools, but separate Bibles to be sworn in the courtroom. And some of the laws descend to the level of absurdity, making it illegal for black and white workers to look out of the same window if they're working in the same factory, for example. This sort of international scrutiny causes the more sober and realistically minded U.S. leaders to come to the conclusion that Jim Crow should be at least reduced, if not eroded. The problem there, and this is where some of not only our intellectuals, but our leaders have a deficit, is that if you look at sports, for example, also I'm looking to write a book on baseball, if anybody has any ideas they want to feed me through social media or otherwise. If you look at baseball, before the advent of Jackie Robinson in 1946-47, the black American athlete with the Brooklyn Dodgers, or the explosion of Dominican players coming onto the diamond in 2016, you could have a one-armed white outfielder like Pete Gray play for the St. Louis Browns because of Jim Crow. So when you allow these exceedingly competent and talented black Americans and Latinos to come onto the diamond, there's not much of a market for a one-armed white outfielder. So even though one can make the argument, and this is what our intellectuals and leaders do, that when Jackie Robinson and company entered baseball, it allowed Major League Baseball to flourish, which is true. You see teams start in San Francisco and Los Angeles by 1957, 58. Television contracts, more wealth generated, which then the players can share in. And that's all true. So in a sense, retreating from Jim Crow was beneficial to many. But it wasn't necessarily beneficial to people like Pete Gray. And I think also complementing, if you like, what I just said, our intellectuals and leaders oftentimes downplay the resistance to desegregation as expressed in Little Rock in 1957, where President Eisenhower has to deploy federal troops to ensure desegregation of Little Rock Central High School. Or Oxford, Mississippi, where I was just visiting just a few weeks ago. University of Mississippi, once again, federal troops have to be deployed so that James Meredith could desegregate the University of Mississippi. The Boston busing crisis, so showing that this was not just limited to the retrograde precincts of Dixie, because the violence and the uproar in Boston was quite significant, as anybody who's familiar with Bill Russell, the black American basketball star, in his memoirs talking about the racism in Boston would readily attest to that. Or in the 1980s and 1990s in Yonkers with the housing desegregation crisis, which was just very usefully depicted in the drama Show Me a Hero, which I recommend. But that resistance oftentimes tends to be downplayed, and it's always sort of assumed that people think it's a good idea to move away from Jim Crow and move away from desegregation, which then makes them surprised when a Donald J. Trump rises and is able to garner mass support. There was a headline in Gail Collins' column in the New York Times just a day or two ago where she expressed surprise that anybody was voting for Donald J. Trump. And you have a number of people who express surprise, but that just shows me they're not familiar with the history of this country or the reality of this country. And even some of our friends on the left have not been very helpful in this regard. I mean, Paul Krugman of the New York Times, to his credit, in his column just a few days ago, introduced the concept of white nationalism. But that comes from a liberal, not from one left of liberal. The conservative LA Times columnist Jonah Goldberg has been talking repeatedly about what he calls white identity politics in terms of explaining the rise of Donald J. Trump. That doesn't come from our friends left of liberalism. That comes from a conservative. One of the problems that we face in this country is that those who consider themselves the most sophisticated in terms of their analysis oftentimes really aren't. I mean, some of these people, I don't even think they read the newspapers every day, which should be task one for anybody who's serious about politics. In any case, that's my spiel for the Sunday afternoon.
Where did the term Jim Crow come from, Professor Horne?
It comes from minstrelsy. Minstrelsy was a very popular performance art in the United States in the 19th century. It involved, among other things, white Americans sort of emulating or imitating in a derisive fashion the way they thought black Americans acted. It leads to the so-called blackface minstrelsy. By the way, I was just reading an article that suggests that blackface minstrelsy is really making a comeback in Australia, of all places, interestingly enough. And of course, it's made a semi-comeback here. Not a strong comeback, I would say, but a semi-comeback. And Jim Crow has descended to us as the synonym for U.S.-style apartheid, so-called separate but equal, as I was just making reference to. Separate Bibles in the courtroom, separate schools. The legacy of our historically black colleges and universities, for example, stem from the Jim Crow system, such as Texas Southern University in Houston, Texas, which in some ways is right across the street from University of Houston. I mean, it's a very stark legacy of the Jim Crow era.
When you go to an Ivy League school in the 1960s, being black, I think it could either cause you to want to join the U.S. ruling elite or to rebel against the U.S. ruling elite. And I fell into the second category. That's an interview you did on the Real News Network.
Right. Yeah, I went to Princeton. And of course, as people oftentimes say about the military, when you're in the military, you're fighting, not necessarily for the flag, although I'm sure that comes into account, but you're fighting for that buddy of yours in the foxhole. That's the way I look at Princeton. I mean, I made some very good friends there. And, you know, these universities, they have a good thing going because they get people when they're 17 or 18, they're first coming into maturity, and they leave a very deep impression on you, which is why Princeton is able to raise so much money and all these other Ivy League schools, because people you get this emotional attachment because of your experiences at a place like this. It was oftentimes said when there was a search for Osama bin Laden before he was killed, that if he had been an alumnus of Princeton would have found it, because they would have been sending him fundraising letters all the time. So it was a very good experience also in terms of politics, because I was involved in the divestment movement. That is to say, as undergraduates, we were protesting Princeton University's ties to corporations invested in apartheid South Africa. So we occupied a building in protest of Princeton's ties to apartheid South Africa. I recall helping to raise money for the students in Orangeburg, South Carolina, who I believe were killed in circa 1969, and recall driving money to a fundraiser in Philadelphia so the money could be distributed to the students. But it wasn't, of course, just all protest. Being at Princeton, of course, I was going to class as well and trying to do well. Although I must say, being at Princeton also primed me for what I'm doing today, because I recall when I was in the classroom at Princeton, in between listening to the teacher and lecturing, I'd be plotting what I would be doing in succeeding weekends. Say, okay, this weekend I'll go to New York, weekend after that I'll go to Philadelphia, weekend after that I'll go to Washington. Now, of course, I'm going to all these places to do research. I wasn't doing that, of course, as an undergraduate at Princeton. I was mostly going to socialize, so to speak. So I have to say, I had a decent experience in Princeton, I must say.
How'd you get there?
Well, that's a very good question. What's happening at that moment, which actually gets us back to this research, is that there's pressure on these institutions to desegregate. There's pressure coming from on high to desegregate. And Princeton, of course, begins to seek out people like myself. Now, as it turns out, I really didn't know that much. Growing up in St. Louis, I have to confess, even though I was reading newspapers, I mean, my first job was maybe 6 or 7 years old on a paper route. So I used to read the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, although admittedly, the comic strips and the sports page. But still, because I was reading the sports page, I knew about Bill Bradley, who at that time was a basketball star at Princeton and was taking Princeton to the highest stratosphere of the NCAA basketball championships. And he was from Crystal City, Missouri, which is not that far from St. Louis. And so even though I wasn't going to play on the Princeton basketball team, I got captivated by the idea of Princeton, and then they came knocking on my door, and so I decided to apply, and here I am.
What did your parents do in St. Louis?
My father was a truck driver. Now, my sisters in St. Louis, they like me to say that my mother was a homemaker, and that's true. But I certainly recall her working, doing day work, as it was called, working as a maid in the home of affluent whites. I have a distinct memory of that. They're both from Mississippi. My mother from Starkville, Mississippi, the home of Mississippi State University, and my father from Columbus, West Point, Mississippi. It's the heart of darkness when it comes to Dixie and Jim Crow. I grew up with stories about Mississippi. My mother used to say, "Don't tell me nothing about Mississippi." I mean, stories about having to get off the sidewalk if some whites are coming down the sidewalk. You have to step off into the gutter, and just these horror stories about Mississippi. I have to say, very nervous and apprehensive about going to Mississippi for the longest. And I still have relatives there I've never met because of nervousness. Now, I have gone to Oxford to do research. This was said a few weeks ago. But I haven't visited Mississippi as often as I should, still because of a certain nervousness. Although I know that that's probably unrealistic, that attitude that I have, but still, it's still somewhere buried in my consciousness. So my father, as a truck driver, he was a member of the Teamsters Union, which used to bill itself as the largest union, not only in the United States, but in the capitalist world. And I used to read their publications because they would be mailed to our house. And subsequently, but not then, I've become fascinated with the St. Louis Teamsters because they had a very interesting leadership. Harold Gibbons. Now, of course, the Teamsters are a union that's understandably and justifiably known for corruption and organized crime ties. But St. Louis was somewhat different. Harold Gibbons was something of a social democrat. And then he worked with other black leaders of the Teamsters, like Ernest Calloway, for example. So that's the sort of working class environment that I grew up in St. Louis, which I'm sure led to me developing this subspecialty of labor history.
Gerald Horne, in the arc of U.S. history, in your view, how significant is the 2008 election?
Oh, I think it's very significant. Now, it's true that many overstated the case, perhaps understandably. This idea of a post-racial society, for example, was a clear overstatement. But given the U.S. torturous past of enslavement of Africans and Jim Crow, it's not it's earth-shattering, it's earth-shaking that a black president was elected. Although, if there's a long textual footnote in my 1776 book that deals with the diverse origins of black Americans. And I put forward the idea that there has been a special persecution of the descendants of enslaved Africans in North America, which is not to say that blacks from an immigrant background, like Barack Obama, have escaped persecution. As a matter of fact, I can't wait to read the memoir literature from this administration, because I'm sure we'll be reading many stories about the kind of disrespect that he received as the first black president, which I think had foreign policy consequences in terms of if foreign leaders are saying, if these powerful elements in the United States don't respect them, why should I? But having said that, I don't find it accidental that the first black president is from an immigrant background, as opposed to the descendant of enslaved Africans. I mean, for example, the activist and professor Angela Davis talks about growing up in Birmingham, Alabama. This is in a book called Dreaming in French by Alice Kaplan, where she says that in order to try to evade the strictures of Jim Crow in Birmingham, she would go into the store and speak French, and then they would not perceive her as a descendant of enslaved Africans. Or I'm writing this book about aviation, and so there's this black pilot who was born in Trinidad and Tobago, who talks about how he's able to escape the more egregious strictures of Jim Crow in Dixie by affecting this British accent, for example. Therefore, he's not perceived as a descendant of enslaved Africans. Or take the singer Babs Gonzalez, born Lee Brown in Newark, New Jersey. But he feels that if he takes the name Babs Gonzalez, that he will not be perceived as a descendant of enslaved Africans. I mean, there are all these stories from the Jim Crow era of black Americans masquerading as African princes and passing all kinds of different ways. Of course, I wrote this book about passing, about Lawrence Dennis, who went on to be the leader of U.S. fascism, who passed for white, quote unquote. He was light-skinned, obviously. And he spoke in this sort of very what we would call a cultured accent, which helps him to evade the reality that he was actually born in Jim Crow Atlanta and born as a young Negro. But it's hard out here being a Negro, particularly then. And so he crosses the color line. So yes, 2008 was no doubt a turning point in terms of U.S. history, although I think it was David Axelrod, Barack Obama's advisor, who wrote in the New York Times some months ago that in the larger scheme of things, you can see the rise of Donald J. Trump as sort of a counter-reaction to Barack Obama, just as the rise of Barack Obama in some ways is a counter-reaction to George W. Bush. That is to say, this so-called cowboy foreign policy to a more anti-war stance, a more urbane cosmopolitanism as opposed to the rough-hewn ways of Crawford, Texas. And then, of course, the counter-reaction leading to the rise of Donald J. Trump.
Gerald Horne has taught at City College of New York, Sarah Lawrence College, UC Santa Barbara, University of Zimbabwe, UNC Chapel Hill, at the University of Hong Kong, and since 2003 has been professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. After he graduated from Princeton, he went on to get his law degree from UC Berkeley, a master's from Columbia, and a PhD from Columbia as well. We've talked for an hour now. It's your turn. Phone numbers are up on the screen. If you can't get through on the phones, try social media. We'll filter through those addresses as well. David here in Washington, D.C., you're the first call. Hi, David.
Hello, how are you today?
Good.
Yes, Dr. Horne. My question is, I would like to ask, could you explain to your viewing audience the role of Haiti in the founding of the United States, please?
Yes.
David, why is that a question? Why is that of interest to you?
Well, it's interest because they don't talk about the significance of the Haitian Revolution and its influence on African Americans and the United States and the founding of the United States. And that question needs to be addressed. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Dr. Horne, it's a pleasure, sir.
Thank you. Well, thank you for that question. I'm always happy to talk about Haiti. It was the subject of my book, Confronting Black Jacobins, which just came out last year. And in that book, my major argument is that the Haitian Revolution, 1791 to 1804, that rarest of events, a successful revolt of the enslaved, ignited a general crisis of the entire slave system in the Americas that could only be resolved with its collapse. Therefore, we in the United States, particularly the descendants of enslaved Africans, owe an eternal debt of gratitude to Haiti that can never be successfully repaid. That's a point that's not only made by me, it was made by Frederick Douglass, the great 19th century abolitionist. It was made by W.E.B. Du Bois, who of course had roots in Hispaniola. Now, oftentimes when the Haitian Revolution is discussed, it's discussed in terms of France, the defeated colonial power on the island, deciding to liquidate its interests in North America, leading directly to the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, which helps to expand the boundaries of the United States of America with this Louisiana Purchase engineered by Thomas Jefferson. I usually don't take that approach, although I mention it in my book, because I think too often U.S. historians give short shrift to Native American history and give short shrift to the land theft that has bedeviled and beset Native Americans. Just as a footnote, I noticed that the Baltimore Orioles baseball games, in reaction to the controversy about standing or not standing for the National Anthem, they're starting to play Woody Guthrie's This Land Is Your Land on certain occasions, which in some ways is a step forward. But in other ways, This Land Is Your Land in some ways evades the question of settler colonialism and the fact that this is Native Americans' land, which oftentimes gets short shrift. But in any case, the Haitian Revolution, like successful revolutionaries everywhere and anywhere, the Haitians try to spread their revolutionary seditious gospel. It's possible to say that Gabriel's Revolt in Virginia, circa 1800, was at least inspired by the Haitian Revolution. Slave revolts, for example, in Barbados in 1816, which led to Britain directly moving to abolish slavery, 1834, inspired by the Haitian Revolution, as I talk about in my book. I also have a long footnote in my book connecting the Haitian Revolution to the Nat Turner slave revolt in 1831 in Virginia, which is ignited almost 40 years to the day after August 1791, when the Haitian Revolution is ignited. There's evidence to suggest that the fleeing slave owners from Hispaniola decamp to Virginia, and many of the Africans have a historical memory of these folks fleeing in horror and in desperation. Of course, the movie Birth of a Nation, which I can't wait to see, about the Nat Turner Revolt, opens just in a few days. I'm going to be first in line to see that movie.
From Counterpunch, published this month or last month, historian Gerald Horne explains why no one should stand for the national anthem. Asked if refusal to honor the U.S. national anthem, given its background and surrounding history, should be the norm rather than the exception, Horne replied categorically and emphatically, of course.
First of all, it provides cover for those athletes who are courageously protesting the national anthem. Not only Colin Kaepernick, who has received death threats, but Doug Baldwin, of the Seattle Seahawks has received death threats. Athletes at the University of Nebraska football team, they protested the national anthem. The political elite of Nebraska sought to reprimand and rebuke them. The Indiana Fever women's basketball team. So we need to provide support for these youth who are courageously stepping forward. Second of all, as many have pointed out, there are some very disturbing lyrics in the third stanza of the national anthem of the United States of America, which, by the way, as I recall, was not adopted as a national anthem until the 20th century. Lyrics that specifically and pointedly denounce the black population. Of course, the national anthem comes in the context of the War of 1812, and if you follow what I said about 1776, it should come as no surprise that many of the enslaved Africans had a choice between the dirty shirt of London or the dirtier shirt of Washington, and they chose the dirty shirt, including and up to August 1814, when the Redcoats sacked the city, including the White House sending President James Madison and his garrulous spouse Dolly fleeing into the streets one step ahead of the posse. Of course, black Americans were in solidarity with the invaders. Many of these black Americans wind up getting on ships and then sailing to freedom in Trinidad and Tobago, where their descendants continue to reside. In fact, I was giving a talk on this subject in New York a few years ago, and some of the folks in the audience were descendants of those Negroes who had fled from the Chesapeake in August 1814. Interestingly enough, the propaganda of Washington has been very successful. A leading professor, whose name I will spare you, at an important university in Washington, D.C., just wrote that the Negroes who sided with the British wound up being re-enslaved. And that was the line, of course, coming from James Monroe, et cetera. I investigated this in my book, Negro Comrades at the Crown. It's basically a spurious claim, but that shows you how potent the propaganda can be. In any case, the national anthem, there are many cases. For example, after apartheid was dismantled or defeated at the polls, shall we say, in the spring of 1994, the South Africans moved to adopt a new national anthem. You already see discussion about that in this country. People are saying, God bless America, this land is your land, America the beautiful. In some ways, the national anthem it's like tree rings, which can be very revealing of what befell this tree years ago. With these pointed lyrics aimed at black Americans, it reveals a certain kind of attitude that I think oftentimes people have forgotten. Also, I think that the national anthem reveals another story. It reveals that you've had a certain integration without transformation. It reminds me of the story about Capitol Hill, a stone's throw from where we're sitting, where when women start to arrive in great numbers, there's not an attempt to accommodate them by having more women's bathrooms. So there's integration of women without transformation of the landscape. The national anthem reveals that too often in this country, we've had a certain kind of integration where those who had been left out of the bounty of the United States forced their way in, but then are sort of told to adjust to the contemporary reality, when actually what we need is transformation if we're really serious.
Dr. Horne, double question. Why do we play the national anthem at a sporting event? It's a private event, private organization. And who cares what the second string quarterback of the San Francisco 49ers thinks about anything?
Well, actually, in defense of Colin Kaepernick, the quarterback in question, number 7, I was just talking with one of your assistants who I agree with. I think he should be starting. Of course, Chip Kelly, the coach of the 49ers, does not have a very good reputation in that regard in terms of dealing with black athletes. Let the record show. Go back and look at the Philadelphia Inquirer when he was coaching the Eagles, for example. Second of all, Colin Kaepernick is a very intelligent young man. I've been reading the stories about his tenure at the University of Nevada in Reno and how he was coming to consciousness. A member of the Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity, by the way, the fraternity of my older brother in Kansas City. And I think that as long as it's, I agree. I'm not sure why it should be played, but as long as it is going to be played, then it provides a platform, I think, for people like Colin Kaepernick and Doug Baldwin and Deshaun Jackson of the Washington pro football team, who has designed these special sneakers, cleats, I should say, that he'll be wearing in protests in the game today. So if they're going to give us this platform, I think we should take it.
Next call for our guest comes from Harold in Jackson, Mississippi. Harold, you're on the air.
Thank you, Professor Horne. I think you're quite right about the national anthem being, being unnecessary in private events. But my question was, do you think the Republican Party is the de facto white nationalist party? Maybe it has been for a long time, or is it ready to embrace that role?
Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, as I noted a few moments ago, that term white nationalism is being revived. Paul Krugman made reference to it in his New York Times column just a few days ago. Once again, I find it striking that that term does not emerge from our friends to the left of liberalism, who in many ways have been asleep at the switch when it comes to analyzing the Trump phenomenon. Our friends who are left of liberal, they keep urging people on the left not to vote for the Greens, Jill Stein, even though we know that the U.S. presidential election is 51 different elections. Those who get the most votes don't necessarily win, as Al Gore could readily tell you. And despite the fact that they're not paying attention to this libertarian phenomenon, where Gary Johnson's been endorsed by the Chicago Tribune, by the major Detroit newspaper. He's polling about 9 or 10%. He presents a mortal threat to Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. And yet our friends on the left are not necessarily clamoring against Gary Johnson. They're clamoring against Jill Stein. Seems to me like it's misplaced priorities. But in any case, back to the question, I think we need a deeper interrogation of this concept of white nationalism. Now, fortunately, the scholars have not been asleep at the switch on this matter. I think one of the most encouraging aspects of U.S. academia in recent years has been the rise of the whiteness literature. That is to say, trying to ascertain how and why it was that those who oftentimes were warring on the shores of Europe, English versus French, English versus Irish, English versus Scots, Serb versus Croat, German versus British, etc., all of a sudden when they cross the Atlantic, they're magically transmuted into this white identity. The scholars have paid attention to that, but somehow in 2016, the lessons of that whiteness literature have been lost, which makes it, which helps to explain why so many folks have been unable to explain or come to grips with this Trump phenomenon, not least the support that he's receiving in places like Coal Country in West Virginia, Eastern Kentucky, etc. As I wrote recently, some of our friends on the left, they're parsing and torturing the numbers to an extent that you would think the only people who are supporting Trump are Ivanka and Donald Jr. You have questions about them even. It's almost like the mythical French intellectual who says that I know what you're saying is true in practice. The question is it true in theory? In other words, they have this theory of the case with regard to how this election should work itself out. And the fact that Trump has gotten so much apparent working class and middle class support disrupts their theory, but they stick to the theory nonetheless. But I guess we'll know on November 8th whether or not they made a misjudgment.
Nick, Lake Hiawatha, New Jersey, email. Professor Horne, in your opinion, do you believe the ecology movement is looked upon as a Marxist attempt to cure capitalist free market schemes of money profit over nature?
I'm not sure if I understand that question, but I think it came up at the first debate by Secretary Clinton that apparently Donald J. Trump has stated in the past that he thought that the whole argument about climate change was a scheme backed by China in order to destabilize the United States. Certainly, it seems to me we need a discussion about the so-called free market. I think that if you look and try to examine how and why it is that there's so much animosity and antipathy towards government in the United States of America, not least the federal government, I think you can make a credible argument that a lot of it has to do with the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War. I oftentimes do this exercise with my students. Because you know how these students are nowadays. When they're in the class, they're fiddling with their laptops, fiddling with their smartphones, et cetera. You're half cocked to what you're saying, maybe zero cocked. And so I go and snatch their smartphone and say, now how would you feel if I take this property of yours and don't compensate you? You'd be very upset and unhappy, wouldn't you? Of course they say yes. Well, that's what happened to the slave owners. It was one of the largest expropriations of private property in history up to that point. Billions of dollars in property in enslaved Africans taken without compensation, leaving many impoverished. Not only many impoverished, but then the former property, the Africans walking around all cheeky, saying, I didn't like you anyway. Which, of course, is very enraging, which leads inevitably to the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, but also to this antipathy to government, which we're still grappling with to this very day. I think these are the sorts of discussions that we need if we're going to try to figure out how the government, for example, is going to execute measures with regard to climate change, such as the recent agreement between China and the United States on the Paris Agreement, and the recent agreement by the European Union to take steps forward on the Paris Agreement. This is going to involve government. I don't see how you're going to escape the potential calamity and catastrophe that is climate change without government involvement. But with this hostility to government in this country, it seems to me that we're getting perilously close to this ideology becoming life-threatening.
Victor, Dayton, Ohio, you're on with University of Houston history professor Gerald Horne. Go ahead, Victor.
Greetings, you guys. Greetings, Professor Horne. I hope one day that you come to Ohio, my state, or somewhere close by, so I can get you to sign the 8 books that I bought from you and my dictionary. I want you to sign that too, because your prose is definitely elaborate. Could you share some of the technical challenges that you often encountered in your research, especially in America? I noticed in the preface of Counterrevolution of 1776, the issue with Daniel Parrish Jr.'s slavery transcript. So I'd like to hear that. Now, the second question is, how can we get the pathetic myths that are mandated as truth and history in American schools, college, high school, elementary, middle school, out of here, eliminated? I mean, this to me is just
Victor. What's one of those myths? Victor, what's one of those myths? Well, the myth of the very Constitution. It was written to support slavery. The myth of the founding of America, as Dr. Horne clearly shows in Counter-Revolution of 1776. The myth about the war with Mexico. It's just a plethora of myths. Thank you, sir.
And it seems like
Let's hear from Dr. Horne.
Well, with regard to the Parrish transcripts at the New York Historical Society in Manhattan, which is a very good source for slavery, by the way, particularly slavery from, say, the Glorious Revolution, 1688, up through the early national period, the early 19th century in the United States of America. It's a very good source. But in the introduction, I note that after I encountered this source, which becomes a source for my 1776 book, I exit the New York Historical Society on Central Park West in Manhattan. And of course, being melanin rich, I have difficulty flagging down a taxi. And then I go into this little anecdote about how, like our ancestors, I turned the negative into positive. So I started walking and getting exercise, guaranteeing that I'll live to fight another day. And then I made an analogy to when I lived in Hong Kong in the latter point of the 20th century, when the taxi drivers used to pass by Chinese to pick me up. Now, that's only because they thought I was probably an affluent tourist who had given them a nice tip, maybe a diplomat or something like that, although the way I was dressed, I'm sure, did not give that attitude. But I went into this riff about how, with the rise of China in the 21st century, another major issue that many of our black leaders and intellectuals are not grappling with, what impact would that have on the black condition in North America? Now, with regard to difficulties in archives, John Hope Franklin, the late historian, used to talk about the difficulty he had in black historian in doing research, because of course, segregation means you can't necessarily come in the archive. And so it hampers the ability of these historians to do their research and to tell the tale, which is one of the reasons why it's my generation that should be in the vanguard, because we generally have access. Although I can remember an episode at the University of Washington in Seattle when I was doing research. God, this archivist was giving me such a hard time, which is my rule in the archives is that the archivist is always right. If there are any questions about that, revert to rule 1. The archivist is always right. So I couldn't understand. So finally I just left because I just felt sort of harassed. Fortunately, that has not been the norm. Although I've had difficulties in certain archives. I remember once going to Antigua in Caribbean, they wouldn't let me in to do my research for whatever reason. With regard to Ohio, I'll be visiting Ohio sometime next year because I'm doing this book on Southern Africa. And at Oberlin College in Ohio, there's an interesting collection about Mozambique that I went to consult, dealing with the founding father of modern Mozambique, Eduardo Mondlane, who of course studied in the United States before founding the now ruling party in Mozambique. So I'll be visiting there. Actually, I was there just this summer. I was at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. They have a very good archive there in Cleveland. It's a very good archive because I'm doing this jazz studies book. And the papers of Ahmet Ertegun, a Turkish American who helped to found Atlantic Records and soared into the highest ranks of the U.S. ruling elite, becoming fabulously affluent, or there. And of course, Atlantic Records recorded many jazz artists. So it's a very revealing archive there.
Professor Horne, you've written 31 books. It sounds like you're working on 3 or 4 right now. What's your process?
My process? Well, I guess it starts with the idea. And sometimes the idea, it comes from conversations that you have with people or with a felt need. I mean, for example, the 1776 book was definitely a response to a felt need as I saw it. Then, of course, there are interests. I mean, I wrote 2 books on film because I've watched lots of movies. And I felt that it just made no sense just to watch all these movies and not turn it into something. I listen to music, jazz, all the time. So it just seems to me it didn't make any sense to listen to this music all the time and not write something about it. And I really like to, here's another crowdsourced idea. I really like to do a book about baseball. If anybody has any ideas. I mean, I'm in touch with the archivist at the Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown, but I'm lacking an idea. So you have to come up with an idea. And you have to have, as a historian, I'm not a novelist. I just can't make things up. So I have to find sources for what I'm writing about, which involves dealing with archives and archivists. And then, you take notes. Of course, to take notes, you have to have some sort of idea of what you're going to write about. I think that's one of the reasons that helps to explain why many historians of 1776 have ignored what used to be called the Negro question, because they didn't take notes on the Negro question, so therefore they can't write about it. Or they don't write about it. And so then you take notes, and then you print out your notes, and then you try to organize it into chapters, and then you write.
Emily is calling in from Boulder, Colorado. Please go ahead, Emily.
I've never called into a show, but I watch Book TV a lot. I've learned a lot from Book TV, but I did notice an error earlier, and I'd like to discuss that second and make a brief point about Francis Scott Key, the author of the Star-Spangled Banner, and I learned this from Book TV. He was the brother-in-law of Roger Taney.
The former Chief Justice.
Yes, of Dred Scott ill fame.
Right.
And that's another reason we should choose another song.
So what was the error, Emily,
yes,
that you want to point out?
I noticed that this is spreading, and the more people who hear it, the more it will spread. And Peter Slen and Gerald Horne have both mispronounced the name Robeson. Sorry, I have stage fright. I grew up in a left-wing household. I heard his name frequently as a child. I met him when I was 5 years old. A wasted opportunity to follow up on a valuable contact. I may say I was too young.
Pronounce it correctly.
It's 2 syllables, Robeson. And I'd like to just very briefly list a few people who have talked about him in documentaries and in other contexts. Lloyd Brown, his friend, ghostwriter, chauffeur, and biographer. I was a friend of Lloyd's for years before the end of his life, and he always said Robeson, not Robeson. Also, Paul Jr., I met him. I worked on the wall labels at the New York Historical Society when they did the centenary exhibition on Robeson in 1998. After I saw the exhibition, I noticed, while I was reading them, I noticed errors. I worked in book publishing at the time, and that was my job. But they allowed me to do some corrections, and that's how I met Paul Jr. Martin Duberman, a biographer of Robeson, I've heard him speak on Book TV. Pete Seeger, Harry Belafonte, Arnold Rampersad, they all use what I consider the correct pronunciation, 2 syllables.
All right, Emily, thank you. Emily sounds pretty fascinating. I will refer for now on to Paul Robeson.
I plead guilty. I think that may come from pronunciations I've heard of Robeson County in North Carolina that I've let infect the correct pronunciation. I knew Lloyd Brown. I think he's passed away by now. As a matter of fact, for many reasons, I regret that Lloyd Brown passed away. He too was a biographer of Paul. And that's because for a while I was thinking about doing a book on the relations between Germany and Black Americans, which has been quite extensive, but not necessarily covered extensively. And that's the background of Lloyd Brown. That is to say, from a German and an African-American heritage. I knew Paul Jr., who's passed away. And his dual biography, 2-volume biography of his father, it's quite good, because oftentimes you run into people who have a famous relative, and they say they're going to do a book, it never gets done, or if it gets done, it's not adequate to the task. But Paul's Jr.'s 2-volume biography is very good.
Professor Horne, did the NAACP start out as a radical organization?
That's a fair assessment, particularly if you consider that their founding in 1909 involved a collaboration between Black Americans, such as W.E.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois, and many socialists. And of course, Du Bois himself considered himself a socialist at the time. But this was not necessarily unusual because, as I've tried to suggest in the preceding minutes, it's not as if Jim Crow was an unpopular cause, that is to say, by those who did not have to suffer under its slings and arrows. But the NAACP, as I say in my first book, which is on Du Bois, Black and Red, has to go through turmoil during the Red Scare and Cold War. They purged Du Bois. He had served with the NAACP from 1909 to 1934, had a falling out with the organization, goes to teach at Atlanta University, where he pens his magnificent tome, Black Reconstruction, which is a so-called revisionist take on the post-Civil War era, which should remind us all, if we need reminding, that one job of historians is revising history and telling a different story based on new interpretations and new sources, something that's oftentimes lost sight of. But Du Bois is purged after he comes back to the NAACP during the halcyon days of 1944, the days of the anti-fascist era, the days when the Soviet Union and the United States were on the same side fighting Germany, then Japan. He's the director of foreign relations. By 1948, the Red Scare is underway. Du Bois is not interested in supporting Harry S. Truman, which is the line taken by many of the leaders in the NAACP, including Walter White and Roy Wilkins. He's supportive of Henry A. Wallace, who was considered one of the closest friends of the Negro, being a FDR vice president in 1940, a Secretary of Agriculture, for example, then sacked by Truman circa 1946. He runs a third-party candidacy, Progressive Party. Robeson supports Henry A. Wallace as well. And this leads to concessions, anti-Jim Crow concessions. Truman moves officially to desegregate the military. But the question is, was the price too high? Because there are compromises and then there are compromises. There are certain compromises that leave you in an advantageous position to march forward, and there are certain other compromises that are crippling. And my historical estimate is that the ouster of the left and the radicals and people like Du Bois from the NAACP is a crippling, handicapping compromise from which the NAACP and the black movement has yet to recover. I would say the same thing about the labor movement, which went through a similar purge, purging people like Harry Bridges, who I mentioned, Ferdinand Smith, who was a Jamaican migrant who becomes the second in command of the National Maritime Union. And then he's, of course, a radical as well. He's purged and then sent back to Jamaica, where he becomes a leader of the labor movement and independence movement in Jamaica. But this has, it seems to me, a devastating impact on the U.S. working class. You can draw a straight line from those purges, it seems to me, in 2016, and the struggles the AFL-CIO is having in places like Youngstown, Ohio, and Eastern Kentucky and coal country in West Virginia, and trying to convince working class people not to vote for Donald J. Trump. And it also has a devastating impact on the black working class, leaving this sector of the working class ideologically unprepared to deal with globalization, robotization, international challenges, etc. That's my own historical estimate. Of course, there are many who disagree.
Omar, Sacramento, California, thanks for holding. You're on with Professor Gerald Horne.
Yes, thank you, Professor Horne, for allowing me to convey a question to you. And I also want to say to C-SPAN, thank you for Book TV. Very enlightening, beautiful conversation. Thank you very much. I had a question about a book I've read by Daniel Rasmussen, a book called The American Uprising, Untold Story of the Largest Slave Revolt. Supposedly a revolt that took place in New Orleans, 1811, and he asserts that this revolt was responsible for actually the establishment of the United States because of the troops that were brought down at the time and established there in that part of the country. And I wonder if you could maybe shed some light on that and just give me some more context, because as I said, it is asserted, but many people I've talked to know nothing about this revolution. It's supposed to be so anyway. So I just wanted to, if you could shed some light on that.
Yeah, I like that book. As I recall, it was a Harvard undergraduate thesis that was turned into a book, and many historians have sniffed at the book, but I think it's significant. This revolt of the enslaved that takes place in Louisiana, as the caller said, circa 1811, carries a reputation of being one of the more significant revolts of the enslaved in the history of the United States. I talk about that particular revolt in my Haitian Revolution book because many of the Africans who were involved in that revolt had come to Louisiana after their so-called masters had fled with them from Hispaniola to Louisiana. But once again, having seen slave owners flee in horror at the sight of angry Africans, these Africans were inspired to try to emulate the Haitian Revolution. I think it also comes up in my Negro Comrades of the Crown book as well, if I'm not mistaken. Now, with regard to its impact on the founding of the United States, I'm not sure what the caller meant, since the United States, was founded in the late 18th century. So I'm not sure what the caller meant by that.
Every guest we have here on In Depth, we ask him or her to supply a list of their favorite writers, what they're reading now, some of their influences. We want to show you Professor Horne's answers to those questions.
Book TV tapes hundreds of author interview programs throughout the country all year long. Here's a look at some of the events we'll be covering this week. On Tuesday at the Seminary Co-op Bookstore in Chicago, attorney William Demarsky will discuss the life of Judge Richard Posner. Then on Wednesday at the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs in New York City, Yale University professor Akhil Reed Amar will provide a modern history of the U.S. Constitution. Thursday at Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Nancy Malkiel, former dean of the college at Princeton University, will look at the decision for many colleges and universities to go co-ed at the end of the 1960s. And on Friday, we're back in New York at the Union League Club, where James Rosen and Christopher Buckley will discuss a collection of essays by the late author and founder of the National Review, William F. Buckley. That's a look at some of the author programs Book TV is covering this week. Many of these events are open to the public. Look for them to air in the near future on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
And our conversation with Dr. Gerald Horne continues here on Book TV In Depth. 202 is the area code. 748-8200 if you live in the Eastern Central Time Zone. 748-8201 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific Time Zones. Several ways of getting hold of us via social media as well. BookTV@cspan.org is our email address. @BookTV is our Twitter handle. And you can also make a comment on our Facebook page, facebook.com/BookTV. Now, you listed Shirley Graham Du Bois' book, Zulu Heart, as one of your favorites. Who was she?
Well, she was a black woman born in the latter part of the 19th century, passing away, interestingly enough, in China in the mid to late 1970s. In between, she was a writer of operas, a writer of novels, biographies, a functionary with NAACP office, but she's probably better known as the spouse of W.E.B. Du Bois.
The second, right? The second spouse?
She was the second wife of W.E.B. Du Bois. And it was with him that she soared into further prominence to a degree. That is to say that they migrated to Ghana, West Africa, in 1961, Ghana coming to independence in 1957 under the leadership of Kwame Nkrumah. And W.E.B. Du Bois was slated to organize the so-called Encyclopedia Africana. After he passed away in 1963, she became the director of Ghana Television and was trying to do some interesting experiments with the use of television and converting into something perhaps as elevated and as intelligent and influential as C-SPAN, believe it or not. And unfortunately for her, the Nkrumah government was overthrown circa 1966. Interestingly enough, the ambassador at that time was Franklin Williams, who was a former NAACP official, a black American, who then Graham Du Bois, Nkrumah, etc., of course, blamed him to a degree for the overthrow of his government. It was an interesting confluence of these two lines in the black movement. That is to say, one trying to oppose U.S. foreign policy, namely Shirley Graham Du Bois, and the others supporting it, namely Franklin Williams. In any case, she migrates to Egypt and lives in Cairo, but then she becomes a devoted follower of Maoist China, which helps to explain why she dies in China and to a certain degree is still celebrated in China. But her novel, Zulu Heart, it's a fictionalized version of the fact that heart transplants, you may recall, were carried out in South Africa by Dr. Christian Barnard. So it's sort of a science fiction, in some ways reminiscent of Octavia Butler, the great science fiction writer, also passed away. Insofar as the people who get these Zulu hearts, they're sort of these European settlers, they're transformed when they get the hearts of Zulus. But I mentioned that book also not only because I could talk about Shirley Graham Du Bois, but also it's sort of a stand-in for an interest I have in creative writing, creative stories, filmmaking, screenplay writing, etc.
Well, I've got to ask you about a book you're currently reading, Sex Workers, Psychics, and Number Runners by LaShawn Harris.
Yeah, she's a young black woman historian at Michigan State University. We were sitting on a panel at NYU just a few months ago, and she was kind and gracious enough to give me a copy of her book. And as so often happens, when someone is so generous to me, I feel compelled to read it. But in this case, I'm learning a lot. It's a very intriguing story. It should win awards. I'll probably see her in a few days at the conference I mentioned a few moments ago in Richmond, Virginia. And at the panel we were on, she was talking about Marvell Cook, who was a black woman journalist for the New York Amsterdam News, who provides some of the source material for some of her stories about sex workers, numbers runners, etc. in New York, writing for the New York Amsterdam News in the 1930s. Marvell Cook was also close to the family of Roy Wilkins, even though they were on different sides of the ideological barricades, only passing away a few years ago. I recommend that book highly. It's part of the marvelous list that comes to us courtesy of University of Illinois Press.
Well, let's go back to phone calls for Gerald Horne. Jim's in Toledo, Ohio. Hi, Jim. Jim, we're going to have to put you on hold till you turn down the volume on your phone. And reminder that you're going to hear a delay if you keep your TV up when you answer the phone. Diane's in St. Petersburg, Florida. Hi, Diane.
Hi. Thank you, Dr. Horne, for this wonderful program today, and thanks to Book TV. My question is, do you have any insights into the new Smithsonian Museum of African American history? For example, does it really represent the level of brutality suffered by African slaves?
Well, sadly and unfortunately, though I'm here in Washington, I have not had the opportunity to visit this museum. I understand that it's very hard to get admission. I understand that you can't get admission before January or later. But I have followed the press coverage of the museum, and just speaking from 30,000 feet, that is to say, not with particular informed insight into the exhibits, because I haven't visited, but speaking on the level of generalization, it seems to be a victory. That is to say that the fact that the torturous journey of people of African descent in North America is being recognized. Now, does it represent the atrocities? I'm not sure. Although I will say this, coming back to the second version of Roots, I think the second version of Roots is really graphically violent, and especially compared to the first version of the 1970s. And I'm not sure why that is. I'm not sure if it's because it was downplayed in the 1970s or people were more willing to accept violence on the screen in 2016. But the violence and the Roots that I've seen so far is rather stark. But once again, the ultimate test, it passes. That's reflective of reality. Because if you look at the advertisements for runaway slaves, for example, which is a major source for historians, you oftentimes find slave owners will say, missing all his front teeth, only has one ear, only has one arm, in terms of distinguishing marks that will help this person be recovered, which obviously bespeaks a certain kind of brutality, which is also reflected in the slave narratives as well, which talk at great length about the brutality. Of course, you recall that Frederick Douglass, the great abolitionist hero from this metropolitan area, spoke at length not only about the violence, but about how confronting violence is a necessary part of his growth as a human being and the development of his psyche.
What do you think about the movie, something you've referenced in your books, Gone with the Wind?
Interestingly enough, here's a tip to researchers. Actually, I just gave this tip to a journalist. I was at the University of Georgia at Athens just a few weeks ago, where the papers of Margaret Mitchell, the author of that book, are cited. And I was looking through the Margaret Mitchell papers to see how Gone with the Wind was received in Southern Africa, how it was received in South Africa. And of course, it received a rapturous reception, at least amongst the settler population. Ditto for Rhodesia. But the Margaret Mitchell papers has quite a bit on how it was received all over the world. It would be a very useful project. If it hasn't, knowing scholars, it probably already has been done. But I was thinking at the time, somebody should go through the Margaret Mitchell papers and talk about how that novel was received overseas. I have to say I'm not a fan of Gone with the Wind. I think it presents a sort of Moonlight and Magnolias version of slavery, a sort of glorified version, a romanticized version of this horrible institution. It helps to solidify, in my opinion, the support for Jim Crow that was existing and obtaining in Atlanta and in Georgia at that time. And by the way, strikingly enough, Georgia was founded circa 1732 as a so-called white colony. No Negroes allowed, not least because the Negroes were always trying to align with the Spanish in Florida, particularly in St. Augustine, to upset South Carolina and points northward, including the prize that was Virginia. So Georgia was going to be this great wall separating Spanish Florida from South Carolina, Virginia, and North Carolina points northward. But it didn't work out very well, obviously, since the 2010 census showed that Atlanta and Georgia has one of the most significant black populations in North America. And it didn't work out as well also because it was hard to find people to work in the fields. And plus, it was reintroducing the class contradictions when you have Europeans in the fields and Europeans in the big house. It disrupts the white united front. And in any case, the slave traders in North America were past masters at smuggling. And so it was quite a powerful incentive to smuggle Africans into Georgia, because the African slave trade was one of the most lucrative enterprises known to humankind. I mean, you could invest $1 and get $1,800 back. With that kind of profit, of course, a slave trader would sell their firstborn, not to mention some African that they did not know. So in any case, I recommend the Margaret Mitchell papers at the University of Georgia at Athens. They're quite well organized. The archivists there have done a very good job. They're very friendly too, by the way. So a visit there must not be avoided.
Dr. Horne, there's a good chance that if you flew into National Airport here in Washington, you took Jefferson Davis Highway into D.C., there's an effort to rename it.
Well, bully for them. I mean, it's long overdue. I mean, it's quite striking that those who tried to overthrow the U.S. government and help to inflict hundreds of thousands of casualties on this land, more casualties than in World War II that the United States suffered, more casualties than in Vietnam by several orders of magnitude, and yet they're celebrated. Now, as I've tried to explain the story, and as the historians have not done a very good job of explaining, those in 1861 in the so-called Confederate States of America felt that they were walking the footsteps of 1776. That is to say, that there was secession from the British Empire in 1776, because in Somerset's case in 1772, London seemed to be moving towards abolition of slavery. And rather than accept that decision, the extinction of profits that it portended, they rebelled and kicked out London. Then in 1836, you have Texas secession from Mexico after Mexico had moved to abolish slavery a few years earlier. Of course, Mexico had a president of African descent, Vicente Guerrero, 180 years before the election of Barack Obama. The secessionists succeeded. Of course, they had to then come crawling back to join the United States of America in 1845 because Britain and Haiti had put so much pressure on them that they thought that they would be overthrown and liquidated. So they joined the United States. Then in 1861, another secession to preserve slavery. And so I think it's, in a sense, it's understandable why there are these symbols of the Confederacy that still pockmark the landscape, because they thought that they were just continuing 1776. And of course, the historians have tried to tell the story about how, no, they weren't trying to continue 1776. Actually, even though we know, as one of your callers said, that the Constitution was not designed to uplift Africans, to put it mildly, but somehow those principles are eternal, which is like saying the principles of apartheid that uplifted poor Afrikaners in the 1940s, per the suggestion of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, by the way, were also designed to uplift Nelson Mandela. So he should have just waited instead of forming Spirit of the Nation Umkhonto we Sizwe and leading a military campaign leading to his being imprisoned. He should follow the example and just wait for these principles to flower like mushrooms after a spring rain. I mean, this barely passes the giggle test, but this is what our children are taught, which is one of the reasons, according to Perspectives, the newsletter of the American Historical Association, their headquarters is right here in Washington, within walking distance of the studio, enrollment of college students in history classes continue to go down. Because, you know, these millennials, these young people, they're not buying this stuff. And the historians seem unable to change. They're not necessarily adhering to market signals, as they say on Wall Street. There's a saying amongst economists that the field progresses one funeral at a time. That is to say, as these older economists die off, then younger economists can take their place and advance the field, which hopefully will help us to understand the Great Recession of 2007, 2008 someday. The problem in a field like history is that the nature of peer review and the way that historians are trained guarantees that the older historians are training people just like themselves right before they expire, which means that the mythology continues to be perpetuated thus far.
Kenneth in Santa Rosa, California. Email, even though I'm troubled by his overall indictment of racism in the U.S. DNA, I'm more troubled by his embrace of socialism. Question, if socialism is such a blessing, why not the mass migration of American blacks and those Houston Nigerian immigrants he mentioned to the socialist paradises of Cuba and Venezuela?
That's a very good question. I think that socialism suffered a blow. Obviously, Cuba suffered a blow when the socialist camp in Eastern Europe collapsed. But on a level of generalization, I would just repeat what I just said, that the French novelist Balzac suggested that behind every great fortune, there's a great crime. I would suggest that behind every great nation, there's a great crime, and particularly if you look at a nation like the United States. I don't think that we lose anything by pointing to the rapacious nature of this country and its history, particularly how it's bedeviled people of African descent in particular. Now, with regard to Cuba, I will always be in debt to Cuba like I'm in debt to Haiti. And the reason is, you may recall that when Nelson Mandela had his funeral in December 2013, dying at the age of 95, then only a few heads of state were allowed to speak, one of which was Raul Castro of Cuba. And that's because of the heroic Cuban role in helping to liberate Southern Africa. In fact, I was just at the Gerald Ford Library in Ann Arbor going through the papers of Henry Kissinger and these other characters. And in July 1975, this is right before Angolan independence, which Cuba helped to safeguard that same year, Kissinger and his staff were running around with their hair on fire because they were worried that the Cuban troops might intervene in Rhodesia and then march all the way to Pretoria. So they prepared legal memoranda which suggested that the Cuban troops might be justified in going to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, but would not be justified in going to South Africa. This is what people were thinking about. And I dare say that one of the reasons why the ANC government, the African National Congress government in South Africa, the party of Nelson Mandela, has had so much difficulty in constructing what they had promised the voters in the spring of 1994 was, I think we've all underestimated the decisive role of the Cubans in bringing the apartheid rulers to the table. But the Cubans were not necessarily involved in constructing the post-1994 South African society, which is obvious, which is one of the reasons why Raul Castro of Cuba was one of the few heads of state who spoke at Nelson Mandela's funeral. And so I think that Cuba's obviously having difficulties. Can I make one more point about Cuba? Okay. This speaks to press coverage, because with the normalization of Obama, which is one of his signal victories in terms of diplomacy, including in a recent article in the New Yorker, I think about John Lee Anderson, it's always portrayed as the United States as being benevolent to poor little Cuba. When actually, if you study this question, what you'll find is that the United States, as evidenced by Barack Obama's attempt to reset with Moscow before February 2014, the Crimea intervention, and pivot towards China, is very much concerned about the rise of China. You might recall that right before the Sunnyland Summit in Southern California with Obama and Xi Jinping of China, President Xi had met with all the Caribbean leaders in Trinidad and Tobago. Chinese investment is flooding into Bahamas, just off the tip of southern Florida. The United States has good reason to have normalized relations with Cuba in order to avoid and evade another October 1962 crisis, such as when Moscow was accused of placing missiles they called defensive in Cuba to safeguard Cuba from an invasion from the United States. The United States has very good strategic reasons right now to have normalized relations with Cuba in the broader context of things and their ongoing contestation with China, which will be lasting for some years to come. That's sorely missing from the mainstream U.S. press, which, as I said, they're all portraying, they're helping poor little Cuba. I mean, it's fairy tales for children.
Barbara, Newark, New Jersey, please go ahead with your question or comment for Gerald Horne.
Yes, I have a comment and then a question. Eugene V. Debs said, as long as there is poverty, I am in it. As long as there is a criminal element, I am of it. and as long as there is but one soul in jail, I am not free. Until we all have a consciousness of connectedness instead of our ego and drama and our desire for excessive money, fame, and power, we will have comparisons and identity conflicts. Is there any way he thinks that we can have consciousness where instead of our identities as race or class or whatever, family, can we ever have a complete connection and consciousness, and then would we have validity, self-validity in a paradoxical sense of all being connected? And then I wanted to ask a question about Maya Angelou, how her history has been...
Do you know what? We're going to leave it at that first question, and so we can get some more calls in. Professor Horne.
Well, a number of questions have come in along those lines, which is, what is to be done? How can we move forward progressively? Which is obviously an excellent question. And the only thing I would say is that after studying and writing about the great scope of Black American history over the centuries, that at least two lessons jump out at me. One is the necessity for organization, and I would say the same holds true not only for Black people, but for Latinos, for Asian Americans, for Native Americans, for the working class, for feminists. And second, internationalism. That is to say, reaching across the borders and reaching across the oceans. Because one of the points that leaps out at you with regard to Black American history in particular is how so often the correlation of forces, the balance of forces, were so tilted against us that in order to countervail that negative imbalance domestically, we had to have global and international alliances. And that's one of the things that's missing now. I dare say that it's a lesson that I would hope the Black Lives Matter movement studies very carefully and intensively.
David, San Francisco, good afternoon.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Horne, I was so thrilled to see your name come up on the in-depth calendar, because one of my proudest political actions in my life was voting for you for vice president on the Ron Daniels ticket in 1992, not just in the November election, but at the Peace and Freedom Party nominating convention in August of that year in San Diego. So I just wanted to lay that on you and find out what you think about that in 1992, your memories, and how you think it might relate to today and the whole lesser evil thing. So thank you very much.
David, what do you do in San Francisco?
Sorry?
What do you do in San Francisco?
Oh, I'm just an office worker.
Thank you, sir.
Well, actually, I ran for the U.S. Senate from the state of California in 1992. I was Chairman Horne of the Peace and Freedom Party. I enjoyed that immensely because when you're running for office, people think they can come up to you and talk to you about anything. I mean, literally anything, about their personal problems, family problems, history, politics, world. So I learned a lot just from talking to people. Got 305,000 votes, by the way. I'll just mention the quantity, not the percentage.
It is California.
Right. And contrary to the propaganda that we particularly hear from our friends on the left, it did not allow the Republican to prevail. I mean, Dianne Feinstein won. That was her first term. She's won ever since. She's still in the Senate in 2016. So I think there's a lesson there somewhere. And I did particularly well, I'm proud to say, amongst Black voters, Black American voters, who I think appreciated having, quote, one of their own, quote unquote, throw his hat into the ring for such a high office, which of course is very unusual.
What was your platform?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I still have the T-shirts from that era. And I recall we had a French horn in the shape of a horn of plenty, you know, cornucopia. It was cute. And of course, free college tuition. We anticipated that for public institutions, which now Bernie Sanders and Hillary Rodham Clinton are touting. Of course, Medicare for all, of course. cutting the Pentagon budget dramatically, slashing it and applying it to human needs, which presupposes a non-interventionist foreign policy, shutting down these scores of military bases the United States has all over the world, and applying those funds to human needs. I mean, those were the basic planks in the platform.
What does it cost to go to the University of Houston for a year?
God, I'm not even sure. Yikes, I can't remember. A question I can't answer, sadly enough.
Rosemary's in Penn Valley, California, and Rosemary, you're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Hi.
Hi. Well, thank you so much. My question is perhaps similar to the lady from New Jersey. It's about not to negate any history or facts, but just what would Dr. Horne's idea be about what the scientists say, that we are all from Africa originally, and so as far as black and white or any other ethnicity goes, we're all mixed, and, is that like a believable thing? And also how it applies to our president, Obama, who he's termed black president, our first black president, but he's biracial, and Michelle referred to him as biracial just recently on the national news. And so why is he black, not white? Because he's my president. I'm predominantly white, but I'm, getting ready to do that 23andMe because my aunt said she did it, and we have African-American ethnicity. And that's my question. I'd like to know what Dr. Horne's ideas about.
That's Rosemary in Penn Valley, California.
Well, these terms, to start off on this level, are historically constructed. What I mean is that for various historical reasons, the United States has adhered to the so-called one-drop rule, which is to say that you can look like George W. Bush or Madonna, but if you have, quote, one drop of African blood, unquote, that means you're black. Now, of course, as I've told my students at the University of Houston, this facilitates slavery, because you could have an Irish person getting off the boat in New Orleans in the 1850s and is kidnapped. And you say, I'm not a slave. You say, yes, you are. You look like this slave right over here. So obviously it expands the boundary for slavery. Secondly, it helps to denigrate blackness, which then facilitates the further exploitation of black labor, not only pre-Civil War, but post-Civil War, with the rise of the so-called convict lease system, where black people were arrested on spurious grounds and then leased out to major corporations for profit-making purposes. And of course, equating black people with criminal, which is one of the reasons we still have so many problems in terms of these police killings, because it's this equation of blackness with criminality. With regard to whiteness, thanks to David Wallstreicher, a colleague at the City University of New York Graduate Center, who, when I was writing my 1776 book, turned me on to the secondary source that talks about the origins of the construction of whiteness. And according to the secondary source, of course, it comes up in the context of the further expansion of the Americas, the expropriation of Native Americans, the enslavement of Africans, because if you think about it, in Sweden in the 17th century, everybody sort of is, quote, white, unquote, so there's no need for that sort of differentiation, and only the need for the differentiation comes with the rise of colonialism, the slave trade, etc. I'm not a physical anthropologist, but to the best of my knowledge and understanding, we all have roots in Africa, from Lucy and East Africa in general. So I think the caller makes a solid point to that extent.
Next call comes from Lawrence in Granada Hills, California. Hi, Lawrence.
Hello, Dr. Horne. I wanted to get your take on Reconstruction Era and whom I think is, although it's debated around in modern presidents, but I think is the worst president in United States history, Andrew Johnson. What is your take on that?
Well, that's a title for which there is significant competition. I was just reading, I think it was in the Washington Post today, that someone was touting James Buchanan, the president of the United States just before Abraham Lincoln, as the worst president in U.S. history. Because after all, He helped, it was during his term that the Dred Scott decision emerged. Now, of course, he didn't write that decision. But Andrew Johnson, of course, in his attempts to conciliate with the slave-owning class, for example, in his home state of Tennessee, if I'm not mistaken, helps to set back the freedom struggle of the newly enslaved. Keep in mind as well that one of the points that's oftentimes missing in the discussion of Civil War and Reconstruction, and in, I would say U.S. history generally, or the concerted attempts to deport the black population of the United States of America. This was not only the case for Abraham Lincoln, who even after the Emancipation Proclamation was negotiating with the Brazilians with regard to sending my ancestors to Brazil. As I say in my book on Haiti and the DR, Dominican Republic, Ulysses S. Grant was trying to send the Negroes to Hispaniola, and that attempt barely failed. If you look at some contemporary work, this new book, Strangers in Their Own Land, which is a study of working class conservatism and middle class conservatism in Louisiana, the sociologist who writes the book takes away the point that many of these white conservatives, as they see it, black Americans who excel, or up to and including Barack Obama, somehow are jumping the queue. In other words, they have this implicit idea of the United States as a white man's country, as the Democrats said in the election of 1864. And so our presence is somehow illegitimate. When I was at the University of Georgia just a few weeks ago, I was reading in the congressional record from 1947, this idea, even then, of sending all the Negroes back to Africa in the United States. So, yes, Andrew Johnson deserves opprobrium. He deserves critique, searing critique, because of his failures in Reconstruction. But if you look at him in the broader context of U.S. history, he doesn't seem that unusual.
This is a text from Stephen Hall. He tweets it at Historian Speaks. Why is conceptualizing African American history in international terms essential to understanding this experience?
Well, first of all, as Jesse Jackson once said, our presence in North America is a result of a foreign policy, the African slave trade. When I teach an introduction to African American studies, one of the points I begin with is the fundamental question, which is how is it that folks with roots in West Africa, minority in East Africa, wind up in North America speaking a language, English, developed in Northwest Europe? Obviously, this is a product of an international experience. When I teach African American history, I'm sure if you could wake up my students who I'll be teaching on Tuesday afternoon, if you wake them up in the middle of the night tonight and ask them the significance of 1453, they'll immediately spout. Well, that's the time when the Muslims were able to seize what is now Istanbul, Constantinople, which blocks the eastward path to the riches of Asia, which leads directly to the Spanish sending Christopher Columbus across the ocean blue in 1492, leading to the encounter with the indigenous people who he thought were Indians, which is one of the reasons they're called Indians, and then the enslavement of Africans. This is all part of a global experience. And so to try to just limit it to the four corners of North America, and particularly in light of what I've said about our alliances with Spanish Florida, our alliance with the British against the settlers in the War of 1812, alliances with Moscow, alliances with India, alliances with Japan, to try to limit it just to North America, it seems to me, is historical malpractice.
Let's hear from Edwidge in Columbia, Maryland. Hi, Edwidge.
Hello, Dr. Horne. A question that has never been addressed, and that is the aftermath of the Haitian slave revolt. Those who led the revolution threw away the French, Jean-Jacques Dessalines, Henri Christophe. They made themselves emperor and king and turned around and enslaved their own. That continued for 400 years, right into Duvalier. who was really putting a lot of people to death because they opposed him. There we could have used a good dose of socialism, like Castro's. But the United States government would not help Haiti because they saw Duvalier as an ally against communism. So how long are the poor Haitians going to continue to suffer? There's a serious class system. Those that have look with disdain on those who have not. And there is no progress being made. A few have all the money and employing people for just a few cents a day. There's also the Restavec. I don't know if you've heard of them. Mm-hmm. The little 8-year-old children who were held who were left at the doorstep of families so that they could help clean the backyard in return for a meal, get no education. I'm desperate as to what can be done to change Haiti and make it better for the people.
Oh, I'm sorry, I thought you were finished.
That's a very difficult question. Like any revolutionary process, such as the Cuban revolutionary process that we were talking about, it's very difficult in these small countries to embark upon this radical path, as the Haitians did at 1804, and have that path be smooth. She mentioned the United States and the enmity from the United States after the Haitian Revolution. I talk in my book about the fact that there is credible evidence to suggest that then U.S. Secretary of State John C. Calhoun, the hawkish South Carolinian, who, by the way, continues to besmirch the Yale University campus to this very day with prominent buildings named after him, this leading not only slaveholder, but ideologist for slave owning, that in one of the most successful covert actions in the long history of covert actions in the United States, John C. Calhoun played a prominent role in helping to split the island. You notice that you have this 1 small island that's shared by 2 nations, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. This led to incessant conflict between the 2 nations that exist to this very day. Perhaps the capstone of that process being reached in the 1930s when Dominican Republic dictator Rafael Trujillo massacres thousands of Haitians. That kind of oppression and persecution of Haitians along the border continues to this very day. Then, of course, there's the story that's often told about how the Haitians had to pay reparations to the former slave owners. Not that the French had to pay reparations to the Africans they enslaved, but the Haitian government had to pay reparations to the French. And of course, many of those French had then migrated to Louisiana, which helps to shed light on why in the antebellum period, New Orleans probably had more millionaires per capita than any other city in the United States of America. So the Haitian road has been very difficult. Then there was the occupation by the United States about 100 years ago, the support of Duvalier, the dictator, and then his son, Baby Doc, up to and including, and I hope my left-wing friends don't get mad at me for saying this, the depredations of the Clinton Foundation after the earthquake of January 2010, and the credible allegations of wrongdoing there. So the path for Haiti has been difficult. Then, politically, I've written about India, I've written about African countries, the Caribbean. Oftentimes, I see my role as focusing on the U.S. role in these particular countries. And I've been criticized for that, perhaps understandably and justifiably. But on the other hand, I'm very reluctant to, from the comfort of Washington, D.C., to issue these stinging rebukes of these poor developing countries that have had such a difficult path. Although I'm utterly sympathetic to what the caller is talking about, because I had to visit Haiti to do this research. And it's not an easy assignment living in Haiti nowadays.
Professor Horne, do you have any right-wing friends?
Right-wing friends. Right-wing in terms of the black community, yes.
What does that mean?
That means that I have friends or colleagues or associates who are anti-white, who think that this community cannot be redeemed. And once again, I see my role is to engage with them, to understand them. But if I just castigate and denounce them in light of all what I've just been saying and all this evidence, I'm not sure if it would be very helpful.
You're a professor of history and African American studies at the University of Houston. Why not just American studies?
Well, if they had American studies at the University of Houston in a coherent, cognizable program, I'd probably be part of it. But I have a sentimental and political attachment to African American studies. This is a field, as recent historians have suggested, that was a product of struggle. These critiques that I've been issuing of the historical profession in terms of their omission of certain subjects or their distortions of certain subjects, this is what called for. This is why black students, when I was a student, were demanding African American studies. And I think that the need for it continues to exist. And I think that this, you should know that this Association for the Study of African American Life and History, which is meeting in Richmond in a few days, it's reaching the point where the membership at its annual conventions are outstripping the attendance at the annual conferences of the Organization for American Historians. And I think this is for a number of reasons. I think, one, people like me, the way I look at some of these mainstream historical organizations is that powerful elites said, subject the Negroes to Jim Crow. They said, yes, sir. And powerful elites said, ease up on Jim Crow. Let the Negroes in. They said, yes, sir. Now, who knows what comes next? Whereas this association, I know as early as 1915, a person like myself could go to their meetings without feeling despised. So I think politically, from my point of view, it's more important to support this organization just from a matter of survival and personal self-interest as much as anything else.
The next call for Gerald Horne comes from Lloyd in St. Louis. Hi, Lloyd.
Hello, how are you?
How are you?
Real good.
Go ahead, sir.
Yes, I want to ask Dr. Horne, is he related to a George Horne, was like a deputy fire chief? He's retired now, and I'm a graduate of Sumner High School over 65 years ago. And a couple of topics, biracial. Well, many blacks are triracial, for that matter. And then we talk about black Republicans. Blacks were Republicans before white folks were Republicans, at least the southern white folks. And now, then last thing, has he read White Trash by Nancy Eisenberg? I'll hang up and listen to your response. Again, I'm proud of you. Take care and I wish you the very best. Bye.
Now, Lloyd, before you leave, Lloyd, you still with us?
Yes.
What did you do if you are retired? What did you do in St. Louis for a living?
Well, I'm a retired school teacher and also an attorney.
What are your politics?
Well, I'm Democrat. My parents were Republicans when I was a kid. I'm 82 years old. And we had a mock election at Sumner High School in the 50s. And the Republican, Eisenhower won over Stevenson. So that goes to show you the history of black folks in America.
Thank you, sir. George Horne.
Not to my knowledge, but as you know, these naming practices in the black community are very arbitrary. I'm still not sure how I got this British name that I now carry. Second of all, what was the second question?
The second one was he went to Sumner High School.
Sumner High School,
Was that your high school?
No, I went to Beaumont, the Blue Jackets.
Then he talked about black Republicans.
Right. It's true that the Republican Party, whose lineage stretches back to the 1850s, it starts out being a party of the Negro, so to speak. As Frederick Douglass said, the Republican Party is a ship, all else is the sea. Of course, the Negroes oftentimes in alliance with business interests in the North. Of course, not necessarily in alliance with working class folk in the South who were Democrat, who had an armed wing called the Ku Klux Klan. And then that party system begins to disintegrate with the New Deal of the 1930s when black people begin to desert the GOP and vote for the Democrats because of New Deal programs, which, by the way, oftentimes excluded them, but still they felt that that was choosing the dirty shirt over the dirtier shirt, which has been the oftentimes unsavory choices that we've been faced with to this point in 2016. What was it? Was there a third question?
Have you read White
Nancy
Trash
Eisenberg.
by Nancy Eisenberg?
Well, I just made did I write it or say it? I can't remember. But there's this literature coming out. I mentioned Strangers in Their Own Land, J.D. Vance's Hillbilly Elegy. You probably had him, I'm sure, on this program. Book TV. Nancy Eisenberg's White Trash. And to a greater or lesser extent, it seems to me they're all trying to explain this phenomenon that's staring us in the face. The Washington Post has a very interesting article about this today. This working class white woman in Western Pennsylvania who's supporting Trump and holds all these bizarre theories about the Obama family, some of which are too indelicate to mention on family TV. And so Nancy Eisenberg, as a historian, is trying to trace this phenomenon of how poor whites have been treated over the centuries. I haven't read the book, but from the reviews, I noticed that some of the reviews feel that, as so often happens with those who examine this phenomenon, that they tend to, there's this tendency amongst historians to always speak of agency, the agency of the oppressed, like slave revolts, et cetera, people, self-assertion. But when it comes to white, poor, and working class people voting Republican, presumably against their interests, they're deprived of agency. They're all dupes. So which is it? I mean, do they have agency or are they all dupes? I think the way to solve this conundrum is to go back into history, as I've been suggesting over the past 2 hours or more, which is that at times it was possible for poor Europeans to get off the boat and be part of this white united front and get land taken from the Native Americans, stocked with Africans, and soar up the class ladder. And so perhaps they think that history can repeat itself. And so perhaps they're not dupes, perhaps they're making a cagey wager, which is the phrase from my 1776 book, that history can be reversed. My opinion is I hope they're wrong.
Somebody says to you, I'm voting for Donald Trump. What's your gut reaction? What's your emotional reaction?
Well, it depends on who that person is. I mean, if it's Carl Icahn, the billionaire investor in New York, I say I totally understand. If it's somebody, a coal miner in West Virginia or Eastern Kentucky, I would do what I'm suggesting that other people do, try to engage with them. I mean, try to talk to them. Try to ask, what do you think you're going to get out of this? What do you think, but at the same time, of course, I think some of these people who are voting for Donald Trump were working class. I don't think that the media, here's a tip to the Washington Post and the New York Times, they haven't used the analogy sufficiently of Jesse Ventura, the professional wrestler who becomes governor of Minnesota. Why did these people in Minnesota think that a professional wrestler, no denigration intended of wrestling, I'm sure it's a very noble and honorable profession, but why did they think that Jesse Ventura would make a good governor? I think that to a certain degree, there's a perverse sort of anti-elite sentiment operating, that they want a bull in the china shop. They just want somebody to disrupt the status quo. It reminds me of Brexit in Britain, which a number of people voted for, which I understand because, I mean, obviously the super state that's the European Union, like Washington, they tended to bail out the wealthy and dump on the non-wealthy. But at the same time, Britain is going to, like these auto producing areas of Britain, where you have Japanese auto plants, they've already going to be announced they're going to be downsizing investment. So this is really going to punish many of these auto workers who voted for Brexit. So once again, I would say that this is a direct product of history. That is to say, not only were left-wing trade unionists like Harry Bridges, Ferdinand Smith purged from the trade union movement, which then set it on this right-leaning path, which helps to destabilize the U.S. working class. But then the United States cuts this deal with China 4 odd decades ago, which is seen as a stroke of genius by Richard M. Nixon, but leads to massive foreign direct investment of China, which obviously was not foreseen, creating this juggernaut that bids fair to be the leading economy and country sooner rather than later, according to certain economists, that's already occurred. you might have noted that in the first words out of Donald J. Trump's mouth at the debate last Monday was a denunciation of China. And there lies disaster, because a conflict with China, I can't see any good coming out of that kind of conflict. And that's what people apparently are going to be voting for.
Do you think Donald Trump is a racist?
Well, certainly I would say that his actions bespeak racism. That is to say, the press has covered to it fairly well this story about the housing project in New York City, where he was sued for barring potential black tenants. I would say that what helped to catapult him to the front ranks of the Republican Party in June 2015, when he descended the escalator in Trump Tower to make his announcement, was his denunciation in no uncertain terms of Mexicans and people of Mexican origin. That helped to ignite anti-immigrant sentiment. And as I suggested in my 1776 book, it's difficult to maintain white supremacy without an overwhelming white majority. And obviously that white majority is shrinking, which leads some to believe that white supremacy in turn is shrinking with those numbers. And that helps, it seems to me, to drive into his ranks many whites who feel that they have something to gain by reassertion, a reimagining, a fortifying of white supremacy. So to that extent, that reeks of racism.
Next call for Gerald Horne is Al in Carthage, North Carolina. Go ahead, Al.
Professor Horne, I got an idea for a book. I'd love to talk more about black power in Appalachia, the name of the book I've been working on. But I have an idea for your book, and that is to carry on from your Du Bois book, modern history of the NAACP, say from when Julian Bond, my brother from SNCC, became president up till today, kind of through the Ben Jealous period, about the last 6 years, and attempts by my brother, Dr. Barber here in North Carolina, Derek Johnson in Mississippi, my brother in Texas, and other state movements in the old Confederacy, and how that has tried to bring the NAACP into the modern era.
Well, that's a worthwhile project. And I would encourage anyone who embarks on that project to pay careful attention to how the NAACP has dealt with foreign policy. I mean, for example, the scholar in Madison, Wisconsin, Brenda J. Plummer, in her most recent book, talks about support in the highest ranks of the NAACP for the war in Vietnam, for example. As I've already noted, there has been a certain kind of circumspection, if you like, to use that euphemism, of NAACP leaders and other black leaders about all these pressing crises, Syria, Ukraine, North Korea, some of which might bespeak planetary extinction. So I think that the caller's project is worthwhile, and I encourage him to pursue it.
This is a Facebook comment, and this is from Joanna Kane. Dr. Horne, do you feel there is a connection between African tribalism and Jim Crow here in America? And how this is the same system playing a role in the numerous deaths in Chicago, which appears systemic? This is a hello from Joanna viewing at ESO1 Books.
Oh, ESO1 Books in Los Angeles.
ESO1.
They're having a breakfast this morning to watch Book TV. It's my favorite bookstore. So I wish that Joanna would clarify it, because I'm not sure if I understand the import of the question. Tribalism in Africa and Jim Crow.
Tell you what, Joanna at ESO1, why don't you go ahead and post another comment? Our producer here will keep an eye out for it, and let's see if we can get a clarification on what you meant. Let's hear from Bob in Huntsville, Texas. Hi, Bob.
Hi, how are you?
Good. Go ahead.
I have a question for the professor. I was raised in Hawaii, and I lived in Hawaii back when Harry Bridges, in fact, I heard Harry Bridges talk one time. I'm interested in the man called Davis, I know Obama was a friend of his. He was an older man at that time, but I also know that Davis was born in Kansas. I happen to have been born in Kansas.
Ooh.
But how did this Davis get to Hawaii, and what did he do when he was there, and how did he meet Obama? I know that I have heard that he was there to help Harry Bridges. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, thank you. I referenced Frank Marshall Davis a few moments ago, and I talked about him in the context of my Hawaii book and how my remarks about him launched 1,000 right-wing blogs with this conspiracy theory about the relationship between Frank Marshall Davis, a black radical, born in Kansas, as the caller said, comes to maturity in Chicago. And by the way, in the next book I'll publish is called The Rise and Fall of the Associated Negro Press by the University of Illinois Press. And Frank Marshall Davis plays a prominent role there because he was a journalist for this black version of the Associated Press, which had journalists across the globe, employed most of the leading black writers of that era, including Richard Wright, Zora Neale Hurston, et al., Langston Hughes. And as the Associated Negro Press started turning to the right, it couldn't withstand the hammer blows of the Red Scare, even though before it was very progressive, as evidenced by the fact that it hired Frank Marshall Davis. Davis decided to move to Hawaii because that was the citadel of progressivism under the U.S. flag, as I've already stated. He did know Harry Bridges. He did work a bit with the ILWU, but that wasn't his primary gig or his primary job, I must say. Although you can check my book on Fighting in Paradise by the University of Hawaii Press to double check that. Now, apparently Frank Marshall Davis knew Barack Obama's paternal grandparents, particularly the father, Mr. Dunham. And it was apparently through Mr. Dunham that the young Barack Obama met Frank Marshall Davis. Of course, the young Barack Obama comes back from Indonesia to stay with his grandparents in Honolulu and go to school there. And that's how he encounters Frank Marshall Davis.
This is Greg Carr tweeting in. Professor Horne, how do you interpret the use by some scholars of the phrase, quote, our history is an African-American history, it's American history?
I understand the sentiment. That came up in a sort of a strange way during Barack Obama's remarks at the opening of the African American History Museum, where he said something, I can't remember the quote, but it was something like, this museum helps to show that black Americans are not a burden. I mean, it was something like that, which I found to be sort of off-putting. And I think that because of the very strong white supremacy that still bestrides the land, and because of what I've already made reference to, which is these persistent and consistent efforts to deport the black people from North America, that black scholars feel that they always have to assert that they're part of this project, they're part of this narrative. So I see it as sort of a defensive reaction. That's how I interpret it, at least. Although I dare say there will come a time when that kind of defensiveness won't be necessary. Matter of fact, I'm sure of that.
Cornel West, writing in a critique of Ta-Nehisi Coates' book, Between the World and Me, quote, how I wish the prophetic work of serious intellectuals like Robin D.G. Kelley, Imani Perry, Gerald Horne, Eddie Glaude commanded the attention the corporate media gives Coates.
Well, you're trying to put me on the hot seat here, huh? I admire Cornel West. I think he's one of the towering intellectuals of this era. I'm happy to call him a friend. I don't know Ta-Nehisi Coates, but I admire his work. I read Between the World and Me. I think he's a very good writer. I understand why the book has been a runaway bestseller, because it's short, well-written, and easily digestible. I think it's anti-racist. In fact, you might be interested to know that there are certain left-wing writers who criticize Coates for being anti-racist. They question that whole concept, believe it or not. I mean, I won't go down the rabbit hole on that concept, but this shows you the ideological confusion we find ourselves in. So I guess the bottom line is that despite my utter admiration for Cornel West, I don't necessarily share his critique of Mr. Coates.
Gail's calling in from Bethesda, Maryland, here in the suburbs of Washington. Hi, Gail.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Dr. Horne, thank you for your time. I'll make my question fast. Do you think Hollywood and the North are just as responsible for the continuation of racism in this country? And I'll explain why I ask with 4 quick points. First, after the war, the North let the South have its way. 2, we have Confederate monuments, not only in the South, but throughout this entire nation. 3, juxtaposed to Germany, there are no monuments or movies extolling National Socialist leaders, and the flag is vilified. 4, it wasn't just Gone with the Wind. The Confederacy narrative was skillfully interwoven in many old Hollywood movies. Recently, I saw a 1954 movie titled About Miss Leslie. The Confederacy had nothing to do with the plot of this movie, but the statement is made in the movie, Robert E. Lee, you can't question his character. And I find this disturbing, and I see it in a lot of Hollywood movies.
All right.
Thank you, sir.
That's Gail in Bethesda.
Well, you're going to have to remind me of some of these points, but yes, the interesting thing about the African slave trade was that it was largely financed from the North. Places like New York City, Newport, Rhode Island, which was an early citadel in the late 17th century of the African slave trade. And then the Africans were brought to the Caribbean and to Dixie. And when I was in my book on the African slave trade to Brazil and the role of U.S. nationals, New York was a centerpiece of financing of the African slave trade to Brazil. As a matter of fact, the late great historian Philip S. Foner, one of his first books, was on the role of New York in terms of African slave trade. And by the way, I was just showing some of my students in class in Houston just a few days ago clips from the film Gangs of New York, which depicts the anti-Negro riots there circa 1862 during the U.S. Civil War, when these Irish people fresh off the boat feel that they're being conscripted to go free the Negroes, and of course they riot, start hanging people from street lamps, etc. So yes, both New York in particular carries a heavy burden with regard to slavery and racism. Just offloading this all onto Dixie just won't wash. And by the way, I mean, my friends in New York, I mean, some of them are living in a cocoon. I mean, you would think New York was Red Vienna, where actually when Eric Garner, the black American who was strangled on camera in the process of selling loose cigarettes in 2014 on Staten Island, New York, by New York City police officers, the prosecutor who failed to bring an indictment, Daniel Donovan, then was promoted. He was elected to Congress in this cosmopolitan, oh so urbane New York. So the caller has a very solid point. And similarly for Hollywood, one of the reasons why I've written at length about Hollywood is because of its complicity in terms of these damaging stereotypes. It did not begin nor end with Gone with the Wind. Of course, Birth of a Nation, coming out of circa a century ago by D.W. Griffith, glorifies the Ku Klux Klan, which makes it rather ironic and perhaps pleasing that a new Birth of a Nation is being released in a few days about the Nat Turner slave revolt, which I can't wait to see. And one more point on New York. I serve on the board of this publication that's left of liberal, that's headquartered in New York. And what's interesting is that my 1776 book, this attempt to unpack the creation myth of the United States, it's been rapturously received by black Americans. Because I think it's not so much because of the thesis, because I show them fighting. Black Americans like to be seen fighting against slavery, even though some of these new school of historians who talk about capitalism and slavery, they don't show that. As a matter of fact, in one passage from this one book of the Capitalism and Slavery School, it's very poignant. This scholar is telling this black student, I'm sorry, I couldn't find episodes of resistance and revolt. I mean, didn't he read about the Seminole Wars, 1819 to 1855 in Florida, the Creole slave revolt in 1841, when the Negroes revolt and take the boat to Bahamas and then are freed by the British? I mean, there are all sorts of episodes. But anyway, this left of liberal journal, in reviewing my book, they said I was anti-white. Now here I've been sitting next to these squares for years in these meetings and accused of being in the tank for Britain when I praised British abolitionism, accused even on this illustrious program for being in the tank for Moscow. I mean, aren't they white? I know that if you critique the creation myth of Israel, you can be accused of being anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish. I didn't know if you critique the creation myth of the United States of America, you can be accused of being anti-white. But that's where we are right now in terms of the ideological confusion that I've already made reference to.
What is that publication?
They don't deserve a mention on this illustrious program.
Class Struggle in Hollywood is the name of the book, and you write, though much has been made of the alleged red influence on the movie's content, anti-red propaganda is easier to discern.
Well, that's for sure. That's the understatement of the decade. I mean, I was a communist for the FBI, for example. I mean, although, as I also talk about in this book, which is worth repeating, that during World War II, when the United States and the Soviet Union were in alliance, at the behest of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Hollywood started producing these pro-Moscow movies, like Mission to Moscow, which you might be able to find on YouTube, which presents Joseph Stalin as a benevolent leader, much loved by his people, A Song of Russia. There are all these pro-Soviet movies produced during World War II, and interestingly enough, even though black people such as Du Bois have been criticized for their alleged pro-Moscow sympathies that were supposedly not in sync with black aspirations, the United States itself can be accused of pro-Moscow sympathies to save its skin during World War II. I guess there's one standard for the U.S. ruling elite, it's another standard for oppressed black people. But despite the example of Warren Beatty's Reds, which is a very interesting movie, which we're going to be marking the 100th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution next year. And that movie should be brought out of the closet, so to speak, because it's very interesting and very illuminating about the Bolshevik Revolution. But what has me interested in Hollywood even more today is what you'll find, I think it's in the New York Times today, certainly it's been in the LA Times, about the Wanda Group out of China, which has been buying up all the movie theaters in the United States. It has an investment deal with Sony, which of course is a Japanese corporation. I think it wants to buy one of the big 6 studios. And Congress, right here in this city, is getting very concerned about the Wanda Group and its investments in Hollywood. And of course, supposedly, the Wanda Group, or some Chinese concern, perhaps is interested in showing your movies in China, caused the new movie Red Dawn, which is a remake of the old anti-Soviet movie from the 1980s, which shows the Soviet invasion. I think it's from Colorado. They wanted to have it at first to be the Chinese invasion of North America. But apparently they were concerned about the Chinese market, concerned about the Wanda Group, Chinese interests in Hollywood. So it's changed to the North Korean invasion. So this country of 19 million people is going to invade the United States, this behemoth of 330 million people. No wonder it sank at the box office.
4,630 strikes in America, you write, in 1945 and 1946.
Well, there's a lot of pent-up energy. Of course, there's a so-called no-strike pledge of World War II, which was this idea that because of the United States in this death match with Berlin, Tokyo, and Rome, that it required the ultimate sacrifice, at least by the working class. But then there's this pent-up energy after World War II, not only because of the no-strike pledge, but I would also say because of the progressivism unleashed by the anti-fascist war. In fact, the communists were elected to office. Ben Davis, who I wrote a biography about, who I mentioned a few moments ago, elected to New York City Council. So the CIO is surging, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, which is now merged with the American Federation of Labor to form the AFL-CIO. That merger takes place in 1955. So that leads to this great labor upsurge, including in Hollywood, which is the subject of my book, Class Struggle in Hollywood. Of course, the union, the Conference of Studio Unions, is red-baited, and its leaders are charged with being communists, although I show that they weren't. But this was too convenient a charge to miss out on. And so the union was bludgeoned into submission. Although I do point out in my other book on Hollywood, on the biography of John Howard Lawson, the Jewish American, who is the founder of the Screenwriters Guild and wrote some of the most powerful anti-racist cinema scenes in the history of Hollywood, including under the so-called blacklist, Cry the Beloved Country, the first version based on the South African novel. I put forward the thesis in that book that the screenwriters, in some ways, were the most sophisticated politically. And I argue that one of the reasons why we speak of film as being a Steven Spielberg movie, even though he just directed it and did not necessarily write the screenplay, in part it's a blow at the screenwriters who were dominated, or at least their guild, their union was dominated by people like John Howard Lawson, Dalton Trumbo, who of course is a comrade as well, who was just the subject of a Hollywood movie just recently. So it's not bad, it's interesting. I'd really like to tackle Hollywood again because it has so many stories worth telling.
What does the American Communist Party stand for today?
Well, I would say it stands for socialism. I would say that it stands for workers' rights. I would say it stands for anti-racism. I would say that it stands for a non-interventionist foreign policy. But I would say, like many communist parties around the world, it suffered tremendously in the wake of the collapse of the socialist project in Eastern Europe, which is another story because even though you had people cheerleading for the collapse of the socialist camp in Eastern Europe, if you look at what's replaced it, many people who were cheerleading for these replacements weren't happy. As a matter of fact, what's interesting, once your grandchildren begin to look at U.S. foreign policy, I think that they'll be struck by the fact that there was hostility to Moscow during the Cold War, and there might be even more hostility today, even though the communists are not in power. And I think your grandchildren will ask, well, I thought getting out the communists would improve things. Apparently it hasn't. So there must be something else going on here. That's the way a historian should think. And then the question is, well, what else is going on that leads to this continuum of antagonism? Or, for example, if you look at Hungary with the Orban regime, which has overtones of anti-Semitism, anti-immigrant chaos that's being sowed, people were cheerleading for, whether they knew it or not, for people like Orban to take over from the communists. And now you have this. But there hasn't been a return to look at that question, to figure out what happened. I mean, I think it's a line from The Great Gatsby about how these folks, they create all this damage and then they just walk away. Well, this is what's been happening.
Sade, San Francisco. Please go ahead with your question or comment for Gerald Horne on Book TV.
Thank you so much for this opportunity to engage with Dr. Horne. I am in awe of your scholarship, and what I really wanted to do is piggyback on the caller from Bethesda, who spoke on the monuments that have been developed thus far in this country. But I really wanted you to reflect on the need of more monuments and historical sites to people who chopped and picked and planted cotton, and to speak on the African connection to that and its overall contribution to the American economy, but more specifically to the Confederates and how Jefferson Davis, in fact, who owned Davis Bend, one of the major cotton plantations in America, and which, in fact, fueled his Confederacy movement. But Benjamin Montgomery, if you have any reference to him and his contributions to, the ownership of Davis Bend, how, in fact, he did, become an owner of Jefferson Davis's plantation, and him being the forerunner of Mound Bayou, Mississippi, and one of the first black townships. But more specifically, really what I wanted to talk about is the need to have a monument in tribute to that cotton narrative. And Ed DeWhite, in fact, is one of our team members, and we are currently working on this project.
Who is we, Sade?
It's the Cotton Pickers. We is CAFRE Inc. out of Mississippi Delta, Indianola, Mississippi, and Mississippi Valley State University. But we are a team of people. B.B. King was our honorary chair, along with Dr. Maya Angelou. Currently, we have Dr. Bobby Rush, who is the honorary chair. But I would love to have Professor Horne's scholarship or our opinion about the need to have a monument such as that, or a historic site that speaks to the significance of cotton in the American South or the American economy
That's
overall.
Sade calling in from San Francisco.
Well, first of all, I say right on to the idea of monuments to those who picked the cotton. As I'm sure the caller knows more than most, slavery was not a sideshow in terms of the antebellum U.S. economy. Slavery was the main event. That's where capital was flowing. As a matter of fact, one of the theses I'm going to develop at this association meeting in Richmond I keep making reference to is the idea that we may even need a redefinition of the term imperialism to take into account slavery, in the sense of seeing the export of capital as not only being banking capital being exported from New York to the Americas, but seeing capital in human bodies being exported from the African continent to Brazil, to Cuba, to North America as a kind of precursor of imperialism, and then trying to theorize and think that through. With regard to cotton in particular, there's a new book by this Harvard professor whose name escapes me right now, which you might want to look at. I'm sure you just put those phrases into a search engine, the book will pop up, which will have new insight, I'm sure, onto cotton. In terms of my Southern Africa research, one of the points that I have now come to is that if from my own research is that if you look at the cotton industry, what's in part happening is that after the U.S. Civil War, you see the rise of a slave trade in Melanesia to Queensland, Australia, and to Fiji with bonded labor. Melanesians, of course, look just like me. This talked about in my University of Hawaii Press book, The White Pacific. And this, of course, leads directly, for now exclude some of the intervening steps, to the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom in the 1890s and the incorporation of Hawaii as a state, and then as a state in 1959. And if you disregard the pre-September 2016 Donald J. Trump, the birth of Barack Obama in August 1961. But I'm also coming to the conclusion that you had a sort of exporting of the cotton industry to Africa, which is interesting. Back to Africa with cotton workers or enslaved laborers being thrown out of work, if you like, or no longer being slaves, and then that industry taking root in Africa, like in places like Uganda, for example. And I'm going to be developing that in my Southern Africa book. Now, with regard to Jefferson Davis, of course, the Jefferson Davis papers, they're receiving, it's a multi-volume set. You can find it at any decent college library. And if you look at the Jefferson Davis papers in the index, you'll be able to find, I'm sure, references to Davis Bend, to Montgomery, to Mount Bayou, and the other points that you just raised. And I would also make this point. The historian Judith Carney, in her book on rice, has pointed out that if you look at the rice industry in South Carolina, that the slave traders oftentimes were not just willy-nilly picking up Africans. They were looking for Africans with certain skills. As I've told my students, it's like if slave traders come to the United States, they say, oh, okay, we might want some mathematicians, so we can grab a mathematician. So they were grabbing people who were growing rice in West Africa and then bringing them to Carolina, which leads to the rice industry flourishing in Carolina. That's Carney, if she wants to follow up.
Tavari, you have 15 seconds to make your point. Greenville, Mississippi.
I have two brief questions. My first question is in regards to African American history. Is there any book in particular that you would recommend that puts it all in a nutshell?
Okay.
And my second question is in regards to police brutalities. I'm originally from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and I've seen events transpire live, and by the time it gets to the news, it's manipulated and distorted. Is there anything possible? Is there anything that you would suggest that we could possibly do?
Thank you, Tavari. And unfortunately, you have 15 seconds to answer the question.
Okay, I missed the second part, but I would say that Eric McDuffie of the University of Illinois and Leslie Alexander of Ohio State are preparing a new textbook on African American history. I think that they'll incorporate these newer revelations. It's not out yet, but I expect it to be out soon, and so the caller should be looking for it.
If people want to get a hold of you via social media, what's the best place for them to do so?
Well, they should put my name into a search engine, my email address. If you want to hear me talk, put my name into the YouTube search engine, the SoundCloud search engine, the Twitter search engine, and you'll get more than you bargained for.
Our guest for the last 3 hours here on Book TV has been University of Houston historian and author Gerald Horne. We appreciate your time today on Book TV.
Thank you.
C-SPAN, created by America's cable television companies and brought to you as a public service by your cable